The morning reports arrived in batches, delivered to the records division in manila envelopes that bore the previous night's date stamp. Each envelope contained the careful documentation of incidents that had unfolded across the city while most residents slept, transformed now into the precise language that police officers used to capture the unpredictable nature of human behavior within the structured format of official documentation. Sergeant Patricia Mills had been processing these reports for 12 years, and she had developed a rhythm that matched the quiet efficiency of the records division itself. She would arrive each morning at 7:30, start a pot of coffee that would last until mid-afternoon, and settle at her desk with the previous night's collection of incident reports spread before her like a daily newspaper, written in the particular dialect of law enforcement. The first report in Tuesday's batch had been filed by Officer Williams during his patrol of the Riverside District. At 11:47 p.m., he had been dispatched to investigate a suspicious person report at the corner of Maple and 3rd Street. The complainant, Mrs. Dorothy Hassan, had called to report that someone was sitting on the bus bench outside her apartment building, and that this person had been there for more than 2 hours without any bus. Arriving to collect them, Officer Williams had approached the situation with the careful attention to detail that characterized all good police work. His report noted the exact time of his arrival, the weather conditions that night, the lighting available at that particular intersection, and the general atmosphere of the neighborhood during those late evening hours. The person on the bench had been Harold Chun, a 71-year-old man who appeared confused and unable to remember his address or how he had come to be sitting at that particular bus stop. The report went on to describe Officer Williams' patient conversation with Mr. Chun, who had been carrying a worn leather wallet containing identification but seemed uncertain about basic details of his current situation. He remembered his name and recognized his own photograph on his driver's license, but could not explain why he was sitting at a bus stop at nearly midnight, or where he had been intending to travel when he sat down to wait. Officer Williams had spent 45 minutes with Mr. Chun, gradually establishing that the elderly man lived approximately 6 blocks away and had apparently become disoriented during what was supposed to be a short evening walk. The report documented the careful process of verifying Mr. Chun's address, contacting his daughter who lived in the same neighborhood, and ensuring that he was safely returned to his family without any suggestion that his confusion represented anything more serious than the kind of momentary disorientation that could affect anyone. The incident had been resolved without drama or crisis, but Officer Williams' report captured every detail with the same thoroughness that would have been applied to a major criminal investigation. He had noted Mr. Chun's general health and demeanor, the daughter's grateful relief upon being contacted, and the steps taken to ensure that similar incidents might be prevented in the future. The daughter had explained that her father had been experiencing mild memory problems recently, and Officer Williams had provided information about local resources for families dealing with age-related cognitive changes. Sergeant Mills found something deeply satisfying about reports like this one. Documentation that showed police work at its most fundamental level. Officer Williams had transformed what could have been a troubling and potentially dangerous situation into a simple story of community care, demonstrating the way that patient, professional attention could resolve problems before they became crises. The next report dealt with a noise complaint that had been called in at 1:23 a.m. from the Westfield Apartments. Officer Martinez had responded to find that the noise was coming from apartment 3B, where Mrs. Jennifer Lopez was hosting what she described as a healing circle for friends who were dealing with various personal difficulties. The gathering had involved meditation, discussion, and what Mrs. Lopez called therapeutic singing, activities that had apparently been loud enough to disturb neighbors in the surrounding apartments. Officer Martinez's report described his arrival at a scene that was unlike most noise complaints he had encountered. The apartment was filled with candles and soft music, and the approximately 8 people present were sitting in a circle on cushions, engaged in what appeared to be a sincere effort to provide mutual emotional support. There was no alcohol involved, no aggressive behavior, and no resistance to his presence or authority. The challenge, as Officer Martinez documented it, was finding a way to address the legitimate complaints of neighbors who needed sleep while respecting the equally legitimate needs of people who were using their apartment for what was clearly a beneficial community activity. His report detailed the patient conversation he had conducted with Mrs. Lopez and her guests, exploring options that might allow the healing circle to continue without disturbing other residents of the building. The solution they had developed involved moving future gatherings to the community room in the apartment building's basement, a space that was available for tenant use, but rarely utilized during evening hours. Mrs. Lopez had been grateful for the suggestion, and several neighbors who had initially complained about the noise had expressed interest in attending future sessions once they understood the nature of the activities that had been creating the disturbance. Officer Martinez's final notes included contact information for the apartment building's management company, which had agreed to make the community room available for regular use by Mrs. Lopez's group. The report concluded with his observation that many noise complaints could be resolved through communication and creative problem solving rather than enforcement action, and that the officer's role in such situations was often more about mediation than law enforcement. These reports represented a kind of literature that existed nowhere else. Sergeant Mills reflected as she reviewed Officer Martinez's careful documentation. They captured moments of human interaction that would otherwise be lost to memory, preserving not just the facts of what had occurred, but the texture of how communities actually functioned when faced with the small conflicts and misunderstandings that could either escalate into serious problems or be resolved through patience and mutual consideration. The third report in Tuesday's batch had been submitted by Detective Sarah Chun, who had been investigating a complaint about fraud at Morrison Electronics, a small television and radio repair shop in the downtown area. The shop's owner, Mr. David Morrison, had contacted police to report that several customers had accused him of charging for repairs that had not actually been performed, or of replacing working parts with defective ones in order to justify additional charges. Detective Chun's report described the complex situation that had required careful investigation to understand fully. Mr. Morrison was 73 years old and had been operating his repair shop for more than 40 years, building a reputation for honest work and fair prices that had sustained his business through decades of technological change. However, recent customer complaints suggested that something had changed in his business practices, with several people reporting that items they had brought in for simple repairs had been returned with additional problems that required expensive solutions. The investigation had revealed that Mr. Morrison was experiencing early-stage dementia that was affecting his ability to perform the precise work that electronic repair required. He was not intentionally defrauding customers, but his declining cognitive abilities were leading to mistakes that customers reasonably interpreted as deliberate deception. Detective Chun had documented interviews with family members who confirmed that Mr. Morrison had been experiencing memory problems and confusion, but who had not realized how significantly these issues were affecting his work. Rather than pursuing criminal charges, Detective Chun had worked with Mr. Morrison's family and the affected customers to develop a resolution that addressed everyone's needs while preserving Mr. Morrison's dignity. The customers who had been charged for ineffective repairs received refunds, while Mr. Morrison's son had agreed to take over the day-to-day operation of the business, allowing his father to continue working in a supervisory capacity that matched his current abilities. The case had required Detective Chun to navigate complex questions about responsibility, competency, and fairness, issues that extended far beyond simple determinations of criminal behavior. Her report documented not just the facts of the case, but the human considerations that had guided her approach to resolving a situation that could have been devastating for an elderly man who had spent his entire adult life building a business and a reputation. Detective Chun's final report included follow-up information indicating that the arrangement had been successful for everyone involved. Mr. Morrison continued to work at the shop, handling customer interactions and providing guidance based on his decades of experience, while his son managed the technical aspects of repairs that required precision and reliable memory. Customers who had been affected by the earlier problems had expressed satisfaction with the resolution, and several had continued to bring their business to the shop under its new management structure. These kinds of cases exemplified the complexity that police officers encountered in their daily work. Sergeant Mills thought as she reviewed Detective Chun's thorough documentation. Law enforcement was often less about applying predetermined rules than about understanding the specific circumstances that had created problems and finding solutions that served the broader interests of community harmony and individual well-being. The fourth report had been submitted by Officer Johnson, who had been called to investigate a shoplifting incident at Westfield Pharmacy. The subject was Mrs. Maria Santos, a 42-year-old woman who had been observed by store employees placing several items in her purse without paying for them. When approached by the store manager, Mrs. Santos had immediately admitted to taking the items and had offered to pay for them. But store policy required that police be notified of all theft incidents regardless of the value of the items involved. Officer Johnson's report detailed his investigation into the circumstances surrounding Mrs. Santos's behavior. She had been taking prescription medications for her elderly mother, who was bedridden and required round-the-clock care. Mrs. Santos worked 2 part-time jobs to support herself and her mother, but neither position provided health insurance, and the cost of her mother's medications had been consuming an increasingly large portion of their limited income. The items Mrs. Santos had taken were not the prescription medications themselves, which were kept behind the pharmacy counter, but over-the-counter pain relievers and nutritional supplements that her mother's doctor had recommended, but that were not covered by Medicare. The total value of the items was less than $20, but they represented essential components of her mother's care that Mrs. Santos could not afford to purchase legitimately. Officer Johnson had spent considerable time investigating Mrs. Santos's situation, confirming her employment, speaking with her mother's doctor, and researching available assistance programs that might help with the cost of medical care. His report documented not just the shoplifting incident itself, but the broader context of economic hardship and caregiving responsibility that had motivated Mrs. Santos's actions. Working with the pharmacy manager, Officer Johnson had developed a resolution that addressed both the immediate incident and the underlying problems that had caused it. Mrs. Santos would not be charged with theft, but would instead be connected with social services that could help her apply for assistance, programs designed to help low-income families with medical expenses. The pharmacy had also agreed to work with Mrs. Santos to set up a payment plan that would allow her to purchase her mother's medications at a reduced cost. Case file included documentation of Officer Johnson's follow-up work with Mrs. Santos over the following months, ensuring that she had successfully connected with appropriate assistance programs and that the arrangement with the pharmacy was working effectively. His final report noted that Mrs. Santos had become an advocate for other caregivers in similar situations, working with local social service agencies to help other families navigate the complex systems of medical and financial assistance. Officer Johnson's approach to the case demonstrated the kind of problem-solving that characterized effective community policing. Sergeant Mills observed as she reviewed his documentation. Rather than simply processing Mrs. Santos through the criminal justice system, he had recognized that her shoplifting was a symptom of larger social and economic problems that required comprehensive solutions rather than punitive responses. The fifth report in Tuesday's batch had been filed by Detective Williams, who had been investigating a series of vandalism incidents at Roosevelt High School. Someone had been spray painting political messages on the school's exterior walls, creating what the principal described as an inappropriate and divisive presence in what should be a neutral educational environment. The messages themselves were not threatening or offensive, but they dealt with controversial political issues that the school administration felt were inappropriate for the school setting. Detective Williams had approached the investigation with the same methodical patience that characterized all of his work, but he had quickly realized that the case involved more complex issues than simple vandalism. The messages were articulate and well-informed, suggesting that they had been created by someone with genuine political convictions, rather than a desire to simply cause trouble or damage property. His investigation had involved extensive interviews with students, teachers, and community members, gradually developing a picture of the tensions that existed within the school and the broader community around issues of political expression and educational neutrality. The vandalism appeared to be one person's response to what they perceived as the school's failure to address important political issues in the curriculum, a way of forcing conversations that they felt were being avoided or suppressed. Breakthrough in the case had come not through traditional detective work but through Detective Williams's decision to attend several school board meetings and community forums where the same political issues were being debated. This had given him insight into the passionate feelings that these issues generated among community members, and had helped him understand how someone might feel compelled to express their views in ways that went beyond conventional political participation. The vandal had turned out to be Mrs. Patricia Chun, a local social studies teacher who had been frustrated by what she saw as the school district's reluctance to engage with contemporary political issues in the classroom. She had been creating the graffiti as a way of highlighting topics that she felt students needed to understand in order to become informed citizens, but that were considered too controversial for inclusion in the official curriculum. Detective Williams had worked with Mrs. Chun, the school administration, and community leaders to develop a resolution that channeled her political passion into constructive rather than destructive activities. Rather than facing criminal charges, Mrs. Chun had been offered the opportunity to organize a series of community forums where controversial political issues could be discussed in an appropriate setting that encouraged dialogue rather than confrontation. The forums had been successful beyond anyone's expectations, drawing large audiences and providing a venue for community members to engage with difficult political questions in a constructive manner. Mrs. Chun had become a recognized leader in promoting civic engagement, and the school district had developed new approaches to political education that satisfied both educators who wanted to address contemporary issues and community members who were concerned about maintaining appropriate boundaries in public education. Detective Williams's final report had noted that the vandalism incidents had ended completely once Mrs. Chun had found appropriate outlets for her political expression, and that the community forums had become a regular part of the civic life of the town. His conclusion emphasized that many acts of vandalism and minor crime were symptoms of deeper frustrations that could be addressed through community engagement rather than criminal prosecution. These reports represented only a small sample of the documentation that flowed through the records division each day. Sergeant Mills reflected as she continued her review process. Each one captured a moment when the normal order of community life had been disrupted, however briefly or mildly, and when police officers had been called upon to restore that order through a combination of professional skill, personal judgment, and creative problem solving. The sixth report had been submitted by Officer Martinez, who had responded to a domestic disturbance call at the Watson household on Oak Street. The call had been made by a neighbor who had heard what sounded like a violent argument, complete with shouting and what might have been furniture being overturned. However, Officer Martinez's arrival had revealed a situation that was quite different from what the neighbor had reported. That Mr. and Mrs. Watson were both deaf, and what the neighbor had interpreted as a violent argument was actually an animated discussion conducted in American Sign Language. The couple had been moving furniture to redecorate their living room, which explained the sounds of items being shifted around, and their animated signing had been misinterpreted by someone who could only hear portions of their interaction without being able to see the context. Officer Martinez's report described the challenge of communicating with the couple, who were able to read lips to some extent, but were more comfortable with sign language that Officer Martinez did not know. Using written notes and gestures, he had been able to establish that there was no domestic violence occurring, and that the couple was surprised and somewhat amused by the misunderstanding that had led to the police call. The incident had led Officer Martinez to research resources for communicating with deaf community members, and his report included recommendations for training programs that would help police officers interact more effectively with people who had hearing impairments. He had also worked with the Watson couple to develop a system for preventing future misunderstandings, including a simple sign that they could post in their window when they were doing activities that might create sounds that could be misinterpreted by neighbors. The case had concluded with Officer Martinez organizing a neighborhood meeting where the Watsons could introduce themselves to their neighbors and explain their communication needs. The meeting had been successful in building understanding and community connections, and several neighbors had expressed interest in learning basic sign language to facilitate better communication with the Watson family. Officer Martinez's documentation of this incident demonstrated the importance of cultural competency in police work. Sergeant Mills noted as she reviewed his careful attention to the communication challenges and community building opportunities that the situation had presented. His approach had transformed what could have been an embarrassing misunderstanding into an opportunity for community education and improved relationships between neighbors. The seventh report dealt with a theft complaint that had been filed by Morrison Hardware, where the owner had reported that someone was systematically stealing small items like screws, washers, and other fasteners that were sold in bins near the front of the store. The thefts had been occurring over several weeks, with small quantities of items disappearing on a regular basis, creating losses that were individually minor but collectively significant for a small business operating on narrow profit margins. Detective Chun had been assigned to investigate the case, and her report documented a patient surveillance operation that had eventually identified the person responsible for the thefts. The suspect was Timothy Wong, a 14-year-old student who had been taking the hardware items to use in a robotics project that he was developing for a science competition at his school. Detective Chun's investigation had revealed that Timothy was an academically gifted student from a family with limited financial resources. His robotics project required numerous small hardware components that were relatively inexpensive individually, but costly when purchased in the quantities he needed for his complex design. Rather than asking his parents for money they didn't have, or abandoning his project, Timothy had begun taking small quantities of the needed items from Morrison Hardware. The resolution of the case had involved extensive consultation between Detective Chun, Timothy's parents, his school counselors, and the owner of Morrison Hardware. Rather than pursuing charges against Timothy, all parties had worked together to develop a solution that addressed the immediate problem while supporting Timothy's academic interests and respecting his family's financial limitations. Morrison Hardware had agreed to provide Timothy with the materials he needed for his project in exchange for 20 hours of volunteer work helping with inventory and customer service. Timothy's school had committed to helping him apply for grants and scholarships that would support his future educational and scientific pursuits. His parents had worked with Detective Chun to ensure that Timothy understood the seriousness of theft while also supporting his academic ambitions. The case had concluded with Timothy winning second place in the regional science competition, an achievement that had brought positive attention to Morrison Hardware's role in supporting young people's educational goals. The store had subsequently developed a formal program for providing materials to students working on academic projects, creating a structured way to support education while protecting the business from inventory losses. Detective Chun's final report had emphasized that juvenile crime often reflected underlying social and economic issues that required comprehensive solutions rather than punitive responses. Her patient approach to understanding Timothy's motivations and circumstances had resulted in outcomes that benefited everyone involved while addressing the root causes of the problem rather than just its symptoms. The 8th report had been filed by Officer Johnson, who had been called to investigate a complaint about illegal dumping in the vacant lot behind the Riverside Apartments. Residents had reported that someone was regularly leaving bags of garbage in the lot, creating an unsanitary condition that was attracting rats and other pests. The dumping had been occurring for several weeks, despite the fact that regular garbage collection was available to all residents of the area. Officer Johnson's investigation had involved careful examination of the dumped materials, looking for any identifying information that might lead to the person responsible. Most of the garbage consisted of ordinary household waste, but Officer Johnson had found several pieces of mail that provided clues about the source of the dumping. The mail had led Officer Johnson to Mrs. Helen Morrison, an 81-year-old woman who lived alone in a small house several blocks from the dumping site. When contacted, Mrs. Morrison had initially denied any knowledge of the illegal dumping, but Officer Johnson's patient questioning had eventually revealed the full situation. Mrs. Morrison had been struggling with mobility problems that made it difficult for her to carry her garbage to the curb for regular collection. Rather than asking for help, which she was reluctant to do because of her fierce independence, she had been driving her garbage to the vacant lot and dumping it there during her weekly trips to the grocery store. Officer Johnson's report documented his efforts to understand Mrs. Morrison's situation and develop a solution that addressed both the illegal dumping problem and the underlying issues that had caused it. Working with social services and community organizations, he had arranged for a volunteer to help Mrs. Morrison with garbage collection and other household tasks that had become difficult for her to manage alone. The case had been resolved without any criminal charges, but Officer Johnson's report included detailed documentation of the resources available to elderly residents who needed assistance with daily living tasks. His investigation had also led to the identification of several other elderly residents in the neighborhood who were struggling with similar issues. resulting in expanded community support services for senior citizens. Final report emphasized that many quality-of-life crimes were symptoms of social isolation and declining physical abilities rather than deliberate disregard for community standards. Officer Johnson's approach had addressed both the immediate environmental problem and the broader issues of aging and community support that had created the situation. The ninth report in Tuesday's batch dealt with a harassment complaint that had been filed by Mrs. Dorothy Hassan, who reported that she was receiving repeated unwanted phone calls from someone who would not identify themselves and who hung up whenever she answered. The calls had been occurring daily for more than 2 weeks, always during the late afternoon hours when Mrs. Hassan was typically at home preparing dinner. Detective Williams had been assigned to investigate the case, and his report documented the technical and interpersonal challenges involved in tracking down the source of anonymous phone calls. Working with the telephone company, he had been able to trace the calls to a specific number, which had led him to the household of Mrs. Patricia Wong, an elderly woman who lived alone and had been experiencing increasing confusion and memory problems. Detective Williams's investigation had revealed that Mrs. Wong had been calling Mrs. Hassan because she believed she was calling her own daughter, who had a similar phone number. Mrs. Wong's declining cognitive abilities had made it difficult for her to remember that she was not reaching the intended recipient, and her confusion when Mrs. Hassan answered had caused her to hang up without explanation. The case had required Detective Williams to work with Mrs. Wong's family, her doctor, and social services to develop a plan that would end the unwanted calls while ensuring that Mrs. Wong received appropriate care for her cognitive decline. The solution had involved programming her phone to automatically dial her daughter's correct number when she pressed a single button, eliminating the possibility of misdirected calls. Detective Williams's report had also documented his efforts to help Mrs. Hassan understand the situation, transforming what had been a source of anxiety and frustration into an opportunity for compassion and community support. Mrs. Hassan had subsequently become involved in local organizations that provided assistance to elderly residents dealing with cognitive decline, using her experience to help others understand and respond to similar situations. The case file included follow-up documentation showing that the harassment calls had ended completely once the technical solution had been implemented, and that both women had benefited from the community connections that had been developed during the resolution process. Detective Williams's final report emphasized that many harassment cases involving elderly people were symptoms of cognitive decline rather than malicious intent, and that understanding this distinction was crucial for developing appropriate responses. These reports, taken collectively, painted a picture of police work that was far more complex and nuanced than the dramatic portrayals often seen in popular media. Sergeant Mills had observed this reality throughout her years in the Records Division, watching as officers dealt with the full spectrum of human problems and community challenges that came to police attention in the course of their daily work. The documentation process itself was an essential part of this work, she reflected as she completed her review of Tuesday's reports. Each report preserved not just the facts of what had occurred, but the thought process that had guided the officer's approach to resolving the situation. Future officers could learn from these documented experiences, understanding how patient investigation, creative problem-solving, and community engagement could transform potential conflicts into opportunities for strengthening social bonds. The reports also served as a record of the community's evolution over time, documenting changes in social problems, demographic patterns, and community resources that affected the daily work of law enforcement. Reading through years of such documentation, patterns emerged that could inform policy decisions, training programs, and resource allocation in ways that improve the department's ability to serve community needs effectively. As Sergeant Mills prepared the reports for filing, she thought about the officers whose work was documented in these pages. Each report represented hours of patient attention to human problems that might seem minor in isolation, but that collectively defined the quality of life in their community. The officers had approached their work with professionalism, creativity, and genuine care for the people they served, demonstrating that effective law enforcement was often more about understanding people than about enforcing rules. The morning routine would begin again tomorrow with a new batch of reports, each one documenting the previous night's encounters between police officers and community members who needed help resolving problems that had exceeded their ability to handle alone. The cycle would continue day after day, creating an ongoing record of how a community worked to maintain the delicate balance between individual freedom and collective responsibility that made civilized life possible. These reports would join the thousands of others stored in the archives below, becoming part of the vast documentation of human experience that law enforcement accumulated in the course of its daily work. Future researchers would find in these files a detailed picture of how communities actually functioned, how problems were actually solved, and how the abstract principles of justice and order were translated into the practical work of helping people live together peacefully despite their differences and difficulties. The quiet efficiency of the Records Division continued its steady rhythm, processing the documentation that transformed the unpredictable dramas of human interaction into the ordered narrative of official reports. Each file would find its proper place in the archives, where it would wait patiently for the next reader who needed to understand that police work, at its foundation, was really about understanding people and helping them find ways to resolve their problems without violence or lasting harm to the community fabric that held them all together. The basement archives of the Central Records Division extended much further than most people realized, beyond the well-lit sections where current files were stored and into older areas where the building's history revealed itself in layers of institutional paint and successive generations of filing systems. Here, in the furthest corners where the fluorescent lights hummed with a different frequency, lay the cases that had been closed for decades, their urgency long since resolved into the peaceful silence of completed business. Margaret Torres had discovered these deeper archives during her first year with the department 23 years ago, when she had been researching a cold case that required examining files from the early 1970s. She had followed a maintenance worker through doors she hadn't known existed, down corridors that seemed to stretch into the building's forgotten spaces, until she found herself in rooms filled with filing cabinets that predated the standardized systems used in the main archives. Tonight, drawn by the particular restlessness that sometimes affected veteran officers during quiet shifts, Margaret found herself walking those same corridors, past filing cabinets whose labels had been typed on machines that no longer existed, containing reports written by officers whose careers had ended long before her own had begun. The air here was heavy with the accumulated weight of decades, dust settling on stories that had once commanded urgent attention but now rested in the profound stillness of historical record. She paused at a cabinet marked 1963-1965, miscellaneous incidents, and pulled open the top drawer, releasing the familiar scent of old paper and metal that characterized these deeper archives. The files here were organized according to systems that had been replaced multiple times over the intervening decades, their manila folders bearing handwritten labels in the careful script that police clerks had used before typewriters became standard equipment. The first file she pulled contained reports from the autumn of 1964, when the city had been smaller and the police department had operated according to procedures that seemed almost quaint by contemporary standards. The handwriting was precise and formal, each report beginning with a careful notation of date, time, and weather conditions that provided context for the incidents being documented. The case that caught her attention dealt with a complaint filed by Mrs. Rose Kowalski, who owned a small grocery store on the corner of 5th and Main Street. Mrs. Kowalski had reported that someone was repeatedly moving the items displayed in her store window, rearranging them according to what she described as an artistic sensibility that was quite different from her own practical approach to merchandising. Officer Robert Chun, no relation to the current detective Sarah Chun, despite the shared surname, had been assigned to investigate what the report classified as vandalism and trespassing. His handwritten notes described multiple visits to Mrs. Kowalski's store, where he had observed the window displays that had caused the complaint. Someone was indeed rearranging the merchandise, creating what Officer Chun described as aesthetically pleasing compositions that transformed the utilitarian display of goods into something approaching art. The investigation had required Officer Chun to spend considerable time observing the store during different hours of the day and night, looking for patterns in when the rearrangements occurred and trying to identify the person responsible. His reports documented this surveillance with the same methodical attention to detail that characterized all good police work, noting not just the facts of each incident, but the broader context of neighborhood dynamics and community relationships that might explain the unusual situation. The mystery had been solved when Officer Chen witnessed the rearrangement taking place during the early morning hours, performed by Mrs. Helena Santos, an elderly woman who lived in the apartment above the store. Mrs. Santos had been unable to sleep due to chronic pain and had taken to walking around the neighborhood during the pre-dawn hours when the streets were empty and peaceful. She had begun rearranging Mrs. Kowalski's window display as a way of creating beauty in what she perceived as an otherwise utilitarian commercial environment. Officer Chun's final report described the resolution of the case through a patient conversation between Mrs. Kowalski and Mrs. Santos, mediated by his presence and facilitated by his understanding of both women's perspectives. Mrs. Kowalski had been initially frustrated by what she saw as interference with her business, but had gradually come to appreciate the artistic sensibility that Mrs. Santos brought to the display arrangements. The case had concluded with an agreement that Mrs. Santos would continue to create window displays for the store, but would coordinate her efforts with Mrs. Kowalski to ensure that the artistic arrangements also served the practical needs of advertising specific products and promoting sales. The collaboration had been successful, with Mrs. Kowalski's store becoming known throughout the neighborhood for its unusually attractive window displays. Officer Chun's documentation included a note that the partnership had continued for several years, until Mrs. Santos's death in 1967, and that Mrs. Kowalski had subsequently hired art students from the local college to maintain the tradition of creative window displays that Mrs. Santos had initiated. The case represented a perfect example of how patient police work could transform a complaint into an opportunity for community building and creative collaboration. Margaret pulled another file, this one dealing with a missing person case from the spring of 1965. The subject was 16-year-old David Morrison, who had disappeared from his family's home on a Tuesday evening without explanation or any indication of where he might have gone. His parents had reported him missing when he failed to return home for dinner, an unusual occurrence for a young man who had never shown any tendency toward rebellious or unpredictable behavior. Detective William Johnson had been assigned to the case, and his reports documented a thorough investigation that had extended over several weeks. David Morrison had been an excellent student with no history of disciplinary problems, active in school activities, and seemingly content with his family life. His disappearance had puzzled everyone who knew him, as there were no obvious reasons why he might have chosen to run away from home. Detective Johnson's investigation had involved interviews with David's friends, teachers, and family members, all of whom had expressed genuine surprise at his disappearance. The reports documented a methodical search of the areas where David typically spent time, including his school, the local library where he worked part-time, and the parks and recreational areas that he frequented with friends. The case had taken an unexpected turn when Detective Johnson received a letter addressed to the police department, written in David's handwriting and postmarked from a town approximately 200 miles away. The letter explained that David had not run away from home, but had instead embarked on what he called a walking pilgrimage to visit historical sites related to the Civil War. Inspired by his American history class and motivated by a desire to understand the past through direct experience, rather than just textbook study, David's letter included a detailed itinerary of the historical sites he planned to visit, along with assurances that he was safe and well supplied for his journey. He explained that he had planned the trip carefully, researching safe camping areas and budgeting his money to last for the duration of his planned route. He had chosen not to tell his parents about his plans because he feared they would not understand his desire for what he called educational adventure. Detective Johnson's reports documented his efforts to verify David's safety while respecting the young man's independence and educational motivations. Working with police departments in the towns along David's planned route, Detective Johnson had been able to confirm that David was indeed following his stated itinerary and was not in any apparent danger. The case had been resolved when David returned home after completing his planned journey, carrying with him detailed journals and photographs from the historical sites he had visited. Detective Johnson's final report included excerpts from David's journals, which demonstrated the educational value of his unconventional approach to studying history. The case had led to discussions within the school district about ways to incorporate experiential learning into the curriculum, recognizing that some students learned most effectively through direct engagement with their subjects. Margaret found these old cases fascinating, not just for their historical interest, but for the way they revealed different approaches to police work that had characterized earlier eras. Detective Johnson's patient investigation of David Morrison's disappearance had required skills that went beyond traditional law enforcement, encompassing educational philosophy, adolescent psychology, and creative problem-solving. She pulled another file, this one containing reports from a series of incidents that had occurred. During the summer of 1965, someone had been leaving small gifts anonymously on the doorsteps of elderly residents throughout the Chico Riverside district, always during the early morning hours when the streets were empty and the recipients were unlikely to observe the deliveries being made. The gifts themselves were modest but thoughtful. Fresh flowers from local gardens, homemade baked goods, small books of poetry, and handwritten notes containing inspirational messages or simple expressions of appreciation for the recipient's contributions to the community. The anonymous gift giver had apparently conducted research into each recipient's interests and circumstances, tailoring the gifts to provide maximum pleasure and meaning. Officer Patricia Martinez had been assigned to investigate what was initially classified as suspicious activity, though no one had actually complained about receiving the gifts. The investigation had been initiated by neighbors who were concerned that someone was trespassing on private property during the night hours. Even though the trespassing appeared to be motivated by kindness rather than criminal intent, Officer Martinez's reports documented her efforts to identify the person responsible for the anonymous gifts, a task that required careful observation and patient detective work. She had interviewed recipients to learn more about the gifts they had received, trying to identify patterns that might lead to the gift giver's identity. She had also conducted surveillance of the neighborhood during the early morning hours, hoping to observe the deliveries being made. The investigation had revealed that the gifts were being delivered by Mrs. Dorothy Wong, a 45-year-old widow who worked as a night shift nurse at the local hospital. Mrs. Wong had been making the deliveries during her walk home from work, using her knowledge of the neighborhood's elderly residents to brighten their days with small gestures of care and appreciation. Officer Martinez's final report described her conversation with Mrs. Wong, who had explained that her work as a nurse had made her acutely aware of how isolation and loneliness affected elderly people's health and well-being. The anonymous gifts had been her way of providing emotional support to people who might otherwise feel forgotten by their community, creating moments of joy and connection that could have significant positive effects on their overall quality of life, rather than discouraging Mrs. Wong's activities. Officer Martinez had worked with her to develop a more formal system for providing support to elderly residents. This had led to the creation of a neighborhood volunteer program that coordinated regular visits and assistance for senior citizens, transforming Mrs. Wong's individual initiative into a community-wide effort to care for vulnerable residents. The case file included letters from several gift recipients, expressing their gratitude for both the original anonymous gifts and the ongoing volunteer program that had grown out of Mrs. Wong's efforts. The program had continued for many years, becoming an integral part of the neighborhood's social fabric and serving as a model for similar initiatives in other parts of the city. These files from the 1960s revealed a different pace of police work. Margaret reflected as she continued her exploration of the deeper archives. Officers seemed to have had more time for the kind of thorough investigation that had characterized Officer Martinez's work with Mrs. Wong. More latitude for creative problem-solving and community engagement. She pulled another file, this one dealing with a vandalism case from the winter of 1964. Someone had been creating elaborate snow sculptures in front of various businesses throughout the downtown area, always working during snowstorms when their activities would be concealed by the weather, and when few people would be on the streets to observe their work. The sculptures were sophisticated and artistic, transforming ordinary snowfall into temporary works of art that enhanced the visual appeal of the commercial district. However, several business owners had complained that the sculptures blocked access to their storefronts and created liability concerns if customers were injured. While navigating around the unexpected obstacles, Detective Samuel Kim had been assigned to investigate the case, and his reports documented the unusual challenge of investigating artistic activities that were technically illegal but clearly motivated by aesthetic rather than destructive impulses. The sculptures were created with remarkable skill and attention to detail, suggesting that the unknown artist had both artistic training and considerable experience working with snow as a medium. Detective Kim's investigation had involved studying the sculptures themselves, photographing them before they melted, and analyzing their style and construction techniques for clues about their creator's identity. He had also interviewed local art teachers and artists, looking for someone with the skills necessary to create such sophisticated works under challenging weather conditions. The case had been solved when Detective Kim observed the sculpture creation process during a particularly heavy snowstorm, watching from a concealed position as Mrs. Maria Chun, a retired art teacher, worked through the night to transform a simple snowfall into an elaborate winter landscape complete with detailed figures and architectural elements. Mrs. Chun's motivation had been both artistic and civic-minded. She had been concerned about the visual appearance of the downtown area during the winter months, when the lack of vegetation and the effects of winter weather created what she considered an unattractive environment for residents and visitors. Her snow sculptures had been intended to demonstrate the potential for temporary public art to enhance urban spaces during the winter, Seasoned Detective Kim's final report described the resolution of the case through collaboration between Mrs. Chun, the affected business owners, and city officials. Rather than pursuing charges for vandalism, all parties had worked together to develop a program that would allow Mrs. Chen to continue creating winter sculptures while addressing the legitimate concerns about access and safety that the business owners had raised. The program had established designated areas for winter sculptures that would not interfere with business operations, and had recruited volunteers to help maintain clear pathways around the artworks. Mrs. Chun had been appointed as the city's first winter arts coordinator, a volunteer position that had formalized her role in creating seasonal public art and had led to the expansion of winter cultural activities throughout the downtown area. The case file included newspaper clippings documenting the success of the winter arts program, which had attracted visitors from surrounding communities and had helped establish the city's reputation as a place that valued creativity and innovation. Mrs. Chun had continued in her role for more than a decade, training other artists in snow sculpture techniques and developing an annual winter festival that had become a major community event. Margaret found something deeply satisfying about these old cases, which revealed the capacity of patient police work to transform potential conflicts into opportunities for community improvement. Detective Kim's investigation of Mrs. Chun's snow sculptures had required him to understand not just the legal issues involved, but the artistic and civic motivations that had inspired the sculpture's creation. She pulled another file, this one containing reports from a noise complaint case that had developed into something much more complex. Mrs. Helen Morrison had called police to report that her neighbor, Mr. Anthony Santos, was playing music at excessive volumes during the late evening hours, disturbing her sleep and that of other residents in the surrounding area. Officer David Wong had responded to the initial complaint, expecting to find a straightforward noise ordinance violation that could be resolved through a simple conversation about appropriate volume levels. However, his investigation had revealed that the situation was considerably more complicated than a typical noise dispute between neighbors. Mr. Santos was a professional musician who worked during regular business hours as a bank clerk, but pursued his musical career during evening hours when he was free from his day job responsibilities. His apartment was not soundproofed, and his practice sessions and composition work required volume levels that inevitably carried to neighboring units. However, Mr. Santos was also the primary caregiver for his elderly mother, who lived with him and whose medical condition required constant supervision that made it impossible for him to practice music outside his home. Officer Wong's reports documented his efforts to understand all aspects of the situation, including interviews with Mr. Santos about his musical career and caregiving responsibilities, conversations with Mrs. Morrison about the specific effects of the noise on her daily life, and discussions with other neighbors about their experiences with the music. The investigation had revealed that the noise complaints were not universal among the neighbors. Several residents actually enjoyed Mr. Santos's music and had been hoping to meet the talented musician who lived in their building. However, Mrs. Morrison worked an early shift at the local hospital and required sleep during the exact hours when Mr. Santos was most likely to be practicing his music. Officer Wong had worked with all parties to develop a solution that addressed everyone's needs while recognizing the legitimate interests involved on all sides. Mr. Santos had agreed to limit his practice sessions to specific hours and to invest in sound dampening materials that would reduce the volume reaching neighboring apartments. Mrs. Morrison had agreed to use earplugs during the designated practice hours and to approach Mr. Santos directly with concerns before calling police. More significantly, the case had led to the development of what Officer Wong described as a community music program that transformed Mr. Santos's individual practice sessions into neighborhood events that brought residents together around their shared appreciation for music. Mr. Santos had begun offering informal concerts in the building's community room, creating opportunities for neighbors to enjoy his music in an appropriate setting while also providing him with an audience for his compositions. The case file included documentation of the success of this arrangement, with follow-up reports indicating that the noise complaints had ended completely and that the community music program had become a popular monthly event that had strengthened relationships throughout the apartment building. Officer Wong's approach to the case demonstrated the kind of creative problem-solving that seemed to characterize much of the police work documented in these older files. Rather than simply enforcing noise ordinances, he had recognized that the situation required a more comprehensive solution that addressed the underlying needs and interests of everyone involved. Margaret pulled another file, this one dealing with a shoplifting case that had occurred at Wong's department store during the holiday shopping season of 1964. The subject was Mrs. Jennifer Kim, a 38-year-old mother of 3 who had been observed by store security taking items without paying for them. However, the store manager had noticed that Mrs. Kim appeared distressed and confused, leading him to call police rather than simply detaining her according to standard store policy. Detective Robert Martinez had responded to the call and had quickly realized that Mrs. Kim's behavior was not typical of deliberate shoplifting. She had been taking items apparently at random, without any coherent pattern that would suggest planning or intent to resell the merchandise. Moreover, she seemed genuinely surprised when confronted about the items in her possession, as if she had no memory of taking them. Detective Martinez's investigation had involved consultation with Mrs. Kim's family doctor, who had recently diagnosed her with early-stage epilepsy that could cause brief periods of confusion and memory loss. The shoplifting incident had occurred during what the doctor described as a petty mal-seizure that had affected Mrs. Kim's awareness and decision-making abilities without causing the dramatic symptoms typically associated with epileptic episodes. The case had required Detective Martinez to research medical literature about epilepsy and its effects on behavior, working with medical professionals to understand how Mrs. Kim's condition might have contributed to her actions in the store. This research had revealed that people experiencing certain types of seizures could engage in complex behaviors without being fully aware of their actions, creating situations that might appear criminal, but were actually symptoms of neurological conditions. Rather than pursuing criminal charges, Detective Martinez had worked with Mrs. Kim's doctor, her family, and the store management to develop a resolution that addressed both the immediate incident and the ongoing challenges that her medical condition might create. Mrs. Kim had been connected with support groups for people with epilepsy and had received education about managing her condition and recognizing early warning signs of seizure activity. The store had implemented new training for security personnel to help them recognize signs of medical distress that might be mistaken for criminal behavior, and had developed protocols for contacting medical professionals when customers appeared to be experiencing health emergencies rather than engaging in deliberate theft. Detective Martinez's final report had emphasized the importance of understanding medical and psychological factors that could influence behavior, noting that many apparent crimes might actually be symptoms of health conditions that required treatment rather than punishment. His careful investigation had prevented an inappropriate criminal prosecution while ensuring that Mrs. Kim received the medical and social support she needed to manage her condition effectively. These old files revealed a remarkable depth of patience and insight in the police work of earlier decades, Margaret observed as she continued her exploration of the archives. Officers like Detective Martinez had clearly understood that their role extended beyond simple law enforcement to encompass community health, social support, and public education. She pulled another file, this one containing reports from a missing property case that had occurred during the summer of 1965. Mrs. Patricia Wong had reported that someone had taken a garden gnome from her front yard. A theft that might seem trivial, but had significant sentimental value, because the gnome had been a gift from her late husband. Officer Helen Chun had been assigned to investigate what was officially classified as petty theft. But her reports revealed that she had approached the case with the same thoroughness that would have been applied to a major crime. She had interviewed neighbors, examined the area where the gnome had been displayed, and researched similar thefts in other parts of the city. The investigation had taken an unexpected turn when Officer Chun discovered that the missing gnome had not been stolen, but had been temporarily relocated by Mrs. Wong's neighbor, Mr. David Morrison, who had been caring for it during Mrs. Wong's absence from town. Mr. Morrison had been concerned about theft or vandalism while Mrs. Wong was away, and had moved the gnome to his own yard for safekeeping. However, Officer Chun's investigation had revealed a deeper story about community, relationships, and the importance of communication between neighbors. Mrs. Wong had not told Mr. Morrison about her travel plans, and Mr. Morrison had not left a note explaining why he had moved the gnome. The apparent theft had created anxiety and suspicion that could have damaged the previously friendly relationship between the neighbors. Officer Chun had used the incident as an opportunity to facilitate a broader conversation about neighborhood communication and mutual support. Her final report described a neighborhood meeting that she had organized, where residents had discussed ways to improve communication about travel plans, property care, and security concerns. The meeting had led to the development of what the neighbors called a care network, an informal system for providing mutual support during absences, emergencies, and other situations where neighbors could assist each other. Mrs. Wong and Mr. Morrison had become close friends through the process of resolving the misunderstanding, and the care network had evolved into a permanent feature of the neighborhood's social organization. Officer Chun's documentation of this case demonstrated the potential for police work to strengthen community bonds rather than simply resolving individual problems. Her patient investigation had transformed a simple misunderstanding into an opportunity for building the kind of social connections that made neighborhoods safer and more supportive for all residents. The deeper archives contained hundreds of such cases, each one preserved in the careful handwriting and methodical documentation that had characterized police work of that era. Margaret found herself drawn back to these files whenever the pressures of contemporary police work became overwhelming, finding in them a reminder of the fundamental purposes that had always guided law enforcement at its best. These old cases revealed police officers who had understood their role as community builders rather than simply law enforcers, who had taken the time to understand the complex human circumstances that created problems, and who had worked patiently to develop solutions that addressed underlying causes rather than just immediate symptoms. The files also documented a different relationship between police and community, one characterized by mutual respect and shared responsibility for maintaining social order. Officers had clearly seen themselves as integral parts of the communities they served, with responsibilities that extended beyond traditional law enforcement to encompass education, mediation, counseling, and social support. As Margaret prepared to leave the archives, she carefully returned each file to its proper place, ensuring that these stories would be preserved for future readers who might need to understand that effective police work had always been about more than enforcing laws. These files contained lessons about patience, creativity, and community engagement that were as relevant today as they had been decades ago. The basement archives would continue their quiet vigil over these stories, preserving them in the peaceful darkness where time moved differently and where the urgent dramas of human interaction had been transformed into the orderly narrative of documented history. Each file waited patiently for the next reader who needed to understand that police work, at its foundation, was really about helping people find ways to live together peacefully despite their differences and difficulties. Walking back through the corridors toward the elevators, Margaret carried with her the knowledge contained in these old files, understanding that the best police work had always required the ability to see beyond immediate problems to the underlying human needs that created them. The archives held these lessons securely, ready to teach them again to anyone who took the time to listen to the quiet wisdom preserved in their careful documentation. The old courthouse stood at the intersection of Main and 3rd Street like a monument to the steady persistence of institutional memory. Built in 1923 from local limestone that had weathered to a soft gray patina, the building had witnessed nearly a century of legal proceedings, each case adding another layer to the accumulated history that seemed to permeate its walls and corridors. Judge Margaret Morrison had presided over Courtroom B for the past 18 years, and during quiet afternoons when court was not in session, she often found herself walking through the empty building, listening to the particular silence that characterized spaces designed for the solemn work of justice. The courthouse after hours had a quality of stillness that was different from any other kind of quiet, a sense of completion and resolution that seemed to emanate from the very architecture itself. The courtroom where she spent her days was a study in understated dignity, with high ceilings that gave weight to the proceedings conducted beneath them, and tall windows that allowed natural light to illuminate the careful choreography of legal process. The wooden benches had been worn smooth by decades of use, their surfaces bearing the subtle impressions left by countless individuals who had come seeking resolution for their conflicts and grievances. On this particular evening, as autumn light filtered through the courtroom windows in long diagonal shafts, Judge Morrison found herself reflecting on the cases that had been resolved within these walls during her tenure. Each trial had represented a moment when the community's commitment to peaceful conflict resolution had been tested and reaffirmed, when the abstract principles of law had been applied to the specific circumstances of human disagreement and wrongdoing. The case that came most readily to mind was one that had concluded just the previous week, a civil dispute between neighbors that had required 3 days of testimony to resolve fully. Mrs. Dorothy Santos and Mr. William Chun had been feuding over the placement of a fence that separated their properties, a disagreement that had escalated over several months until it required formal legal intervention to prevent further deterioration of their relationship. The case had involved complex questions about property boundaries, easement rights, and local zoning regulations. But beneath these technical issues lay deeper questions about communication, respect, and the responsibilities that neighbors had toward each other. Judge Morrison had listened to hours of testimony about surveyor reports, municipal records, and the precise history of property ownership. But she had also heard the frustration and hurt feelings that had transformed a simple boundary dispute into a source of ongoing community tension. Asterisk. The resolution had required not just a legal determination about the proper placement of the fence, but a broader understanding of how neighbors could maintain peaceful relationships even when they disagreed about practical matters. Judge Morrison had worked with both parties to develop an agreement that addressed not only the immediate fence dispute, but also the communication problems that had allowed the disagreement to escalate unnecessarily. The final settlement had included provisions for regular communication between the neighbors about property maintenance issues, a shared responsibility for the cost of the new survey that would eliminate future boundary disputes, and a commitment to seek mediation before pursuing legal action if similar conflicts arose in the future. More importantly, the process had allowed both parties to express their concerns and feelings in a structured environment that promoted understanding rather than continued antagonism. Judge Morrison had observed many such cases during her years on the bench, conflicts that reflected the ordinary challenges of community life and the importance of having institutions capable of resolving disputes before they caused lasting damage to social relationships. The courthouse served as more than just a venue for legal proceedings. It was a community resource for transforming conflict into understanding and disagreement into resolution. The building itself seemed designed to promote this kind of constructive resolution, with its measured proportions and dignified atmosphere, creating an environment where people could step back from the immediate emotions of their disputes and consider broader questions of fairness, responsibility, and community harmony. The architecture spoke of permanence and stability, qualities that helped remind everyone involved that individual conflicts were temporary disruptions in the larger, ongoing project of maintaining civilized society. Asterisk. Walking through the corridors after court hours, Judge Morrison often passed the holding cells that were located in the basement level of the courthouse. These small rooms served as temporary housing for individuals who were awaiting trial or sentencing, and their stark simplicity provided a stark contrast to the formal dignity of the courtrooms above. The cells were clean and well-maintained, but their basic functionality served as a reminder of the serious consequences that could follow from the failure to resolve conflicts through peaceful means. The holding area was supervised by Deputy Sheriff Patricia Wong, who had been responsible for courthouse security for the past 14 years. Deputy Wong understood that her role extended beyond simple custody and security to encompass the important work of maintaining human dignity, even in the constrained environment of detention. She approached her responsibilities with professionalism and compassion, recognizing that the people in her care were often experiencing some of the most difficult moments of their lives. Deputy Wong had developed procedures that balanced security requirements with respect for individual humanity, ensuring that people in custody were treated with courtesy and provided with basic necessities while maintaining the order and safety that the courthouse environment required. Her approach reflected an understanding that the justice system's legitimacy depended not just on its ability to impose consequences for wrongdoing, but on its commitment to treating everyone involved with fundamental respect for their human dignity. The cells themselves were simple but adequate, each one equipped with a narrow bed, a small table, and basic sanitary facilities. The walls were painted a neutral beige color that was intended to be calming rather than oppressive, and each cell had a small window that provided natural light and a limited view of the courthouse grounds. The environment was designed to be secure without being unnecessarily harsh, reflecting the principle that detention should serve the practical purposes of the justice system without inflicting additional punishment beyond what had been formally imposed. During quiet periods, Deputy Wong often found herself reflecting on the individuals who had passed through these cells over the years, people whose lives had intersected with the justice system for reasons ranging from simple misunderstandings to serious criminal behavior. Each person had brought their own story, their own circumstances, and their own potential for redemption or rehabilitation, and Deputy Wong had learned to see beyond the immediate reasons for their detention to the complex human realities that had brought them to this place. One case that remained particularly vivid in her memory involved a young man named David Morrison who had been arrested for vandalism after spray painting graffiti on several downtown buildings. David had spent 2 nights in the holding cells while awaiting his initial court appearance, and during that time Deputy Wong had observed his transformation from angry defiance to thoughtful reflection about the consequences of his actions. David had initially been hostile and uncooperative, expressing resentment about what he saw as an unjust arrest for what he considered artistic expression rather than criminal vandalism. However, the quiet environment of the cell and the time for reflection that detention provided had allowed him to consider his actions from different perspectives, including the impact on property owners and the broader Community's interest in maintaining attractive public spaces. Deputy Wong had facilitated conversations between David and several community members, including local artists who helped him understand how creative expression could be channeled into legal venues that would allow him to develop his talents without causing property damage. These conversations had taken place in the small conference room adjacent to the holding area, a space designed for meetings between detainees and their attorneys, but also used for the kind of community mediation that could transform detention from simple punishment into an opportunity for education and growth. The resolution of David's case had involved a combination of formal legal consequences and community service that addressed both the immediate damage he had caused and the underlying artistic impulses that had motivated his actions. He had been required to clean the graffiti he had created and to pay for any damage that could not be fully repaired. But he had also been connected with a community arts program that provided legal opportunities for public artistic expression. David had subsequently become a recognized local artist whose work was featured in community galleries and public art installations, transforming his initial conflict with the law into a positive contribution to the cultural life of the community. Deputy Wong had maintained contact with David over the years, watching with satisfaction as he developed his talents and became a mentor for other young people who were struggling to find constructive outlets for their creative energy. Courthouse also contained several small conference rooms that were used for plea negotiations, settlement discussions, and other legal meetings that required privacy but did not need the formal atmosphere of the courtroom itself. These rooms were furnished simply but comfortably, with small tables and chairs arranged to promote conversation rather than confrontation, and large windows that provided natural light and views of the courthouse grounds. Attorney Sarah Kim had been practicing law in the courthouse for more than 20 years, and she had conducted hundreds of negotiations and client meetings in these conference rooms. She had observed how the environment of these spaces could influence the tone and outcome of legal discussions, promoting the kind of honest communication that was essential for reaching fair and lasting resolutions to legal disputes. Conference rooms were designed to facilitate the difficult conversations that were often necessary for resolving legal conflicts, providing a neutral space where opposing parties could meet without the formal constraints of courtroom procedure, but also without the emotional baggage that might be associated with meeting in one party's office or home. The rooms served as a kind of neutral ground where people could focus on problem solving rather than position taking, seeking solutions that addressed everyone's legitimate interests rather than simply pursuing victory for one side or the other. Attorney Kim had found that some of her most successful case resolutions had taken place in these quiet conference rooms, where the pressures and distractions of the outside world were temporarily set aside, and where people could focus on the specific issues that needed to be addressed. The rooms provided a sanctuary for the kind of careful listening and thoughtful discussion that was often impossible in the more heated atmosphere of active litigation. One case that exemplified this process had involved a contract dispute between Morrison Construction Company and the owners of several downtown buildings who had hired the company to perform renovation work. The dispute had arisen when the building owners had claimed that the work had not been completed according to specifications, while Morrison Construction had maintained that the owners had made additional demands beyond what had been specified in the original contract. The case had been scheduled for trial, but Attorney Kim had arranged for settlement negotiations to take place in Conference Room C, where representatives from both sides could meet in a less adversarial environment than the courtroom would provide. The negotiations had extended over several days, with each session building on the progress of the previous meetings and gradually developing a resolution that addressed the legitimate concerns of both parties. Final settlement had included provisions for completing the renovation work according to modified specifications that satisfied the building owner's needs while recognizing the additional costs that Morrison Construction would incur, along with new procedures for communication and project management that would prevent similar disputes in future construction projects. More importantly, the negotiation process had preserved the business relationships between the parties, allowing them to continue working together on future projects, rather than becoming permanent adversaries. Attorney Kim had observed that the courthouse conference rooms seemed to promote this kind of constructive problem solving, providing an environment where people could step back from their immediate positions and consider broader questions of fairness, practicality, and long-term relationship preservation. The rooms embodied the principle that the justice system should serve as a resource for resolving conflicts rather than simply a forum for determining winners and losers. The courthouse building also included a law library that served both the legal professionals who worked in the building and members of the public who needed access to legal information for representing themselves in court proceedings. The library was located on the second floor, with tall windows that provided abundant natural light for reading and research, and shelves lined with legal texts that represented the accumulated wisdom of centuries of jurisprudence. Librarian Helen Chun had been responsible for maintaining the law library for the past 16 years, and she had developed an understanding of how legal research could serve not just technical legal needs, but also the broader community goal of ensuring that everyone had access to the information necessary for understanding and participating in the justice system. The library served as a bridge between the formal legal establishment and ordinary citizens who needed to navigate legal processes without professional assistance. The library contained not just legal texts and case reports, but also practical guides for representing oneself in court, explanations of legal procedures written in plain language, and resources for understanding the rights and responsibilities that applied to various legal situations. Librarian Chun had worked to make these resources accessible to people with varying levels of education and legal sophistication, recognizing that the justice system's legitimacy depended on its accessibility to all community members, rather than just legal professionals. The library also served as a quiet space for reflection and preparation, where people could research their cases, prepare their arguments, and consider the legal and practical implications of their various options. The environment was designed to promote careful thought and thorough preparation, recognizing that good legal outcomes often depended on adequate preparation and understanding rather than dramatic courtroom performance. Librarian Chun had observed many instances where access to legal information had empowered people to resolve their disputes without formal legal proceedings, using their research to understand their rights and responsibilities and to negotiate fair solutions with the other parties involved. The library served as a resource for prevention as well as resolution, helping people understand how to avoid legal problems and how to address conflicts before they required formal court intervention. One case that illustrated this principle had involved Mrs. Patricia Santos, who had been facing eviction from her apartment due to what her landlord claimed were violations of her lease agreement. Mrs. Santos had come to the law library to research tenant rights and landlord responsibilities, spending several days reading relevant statutes and case law to understand her legal position. Her research had revealed that her landlord had not followed proper procedures for addressing lease violations, and that several of the claimed violations were actually the landlord's responsibility rather than hers. Armed with this information, Mrs. Santos had been able to negotiate with her landlord to resolve the underlying issues and maintain her tenancy, avoiding the disruption and expense of formal eviction proceedings. The case had demonstrated how access to legal information could level the playing field between parties with unequal resources, allowing ordinary citizens to understand and enforce their rights, even when facing opposition from more sophisticated or well-funded adversaries. The law library served as a democratizing force within the justice system, ensuring that legal knowledge was not the exclusive province of professional attorneys. The courthouse building itself stood as a testament to the community's commitment to resolving conflicts through peaceful, structured processes rather than through violence or arbitrary exercise of power. Its solid construction and dignified architecture conveyed the message that justice was not temporary or expedient, but permanent and principled, based on enduring values rather than shifting political pressures. The building had been designed during an era when public architecture was intended to inspire civic pride and confidence in democratic institutions, and its classical proportions and careful details reflected the belief that physical beauty could support and enhance the important work conducted within. The courthouse was not just a functional facility, but a symbol of the community's aspiration to maintain order through law rather than force, through discussion rather than violence. Walking through the building during quiet evening hours, when the day's legal proceedings had concluded and the corridors were empty except for the security staff, who maintained their vigilant watch, visitors could sense the accumulated weight of all the cases that had been resolved within these walls. Each trial, each negotiation, each moment of legal resolution had added to the building's institutional memory, creating an environment where the abstract principles of justice had been repeatedly tested and reaffirmed through their application to specific human circumstances. The courthouse represented more than just a venue for legal proceedings. It embodied the community's commitment to the principle that conflicts could be resolved through reason rather than force, through structured discussion rather than arbitrary decision-making. The building served as a physical reminder that civilization depended on institutions capable of transforming disagreement into understanding, conflict into resolution, and chaos into order. The empty courtrooms, the quiet holding cells, the peaceful conference rooms, and the well-stocked library all contributed to an environment where the messy realities of human conflict could be addressed through the patient application of legal principles and community values. The courthouse stood as a monument to the possibility of justice, not as an abstract ideal, but as a practical reality that could be achieved through the patient work of people committed to treating each other with dignity and respect, even in the midst of serious disagreement. As night settled over the courthouse and the building entered its quietest hours, the institutional memory held within its walls continued its patient vigil over the community's commitment to peaceful conflict resolution. The empty rooms waited for tomorrow's cases, tomorrow's opportunities to transform conflict into understanding, tomorrow's chances to demonstrate that justice was not just an ideal but a practical reality that could be achieved through the careful application of law, reason, and mutual respect. The courthouse stood as a beacon of hope in a world often torn by conflict and disagreement, proof that human beings could create institutions capable of resolving their differences without violence or lasting harm to the social fabric that held their community together. Within its walls, the patient work of justice continued, one case at a time, one resolution at a time, one small victory for civilization at a time. The Riverside District had evolved slowly over the decades, its tree-lined streets and modest homes creating the kind of neighborhood where 3 generations might live within walking distance of each other, where children grew up knowing not just their own families, but the extended network of neighbors, shopkeepers, and community members who formed the invisible safety net of daily life. Crime, when it touched this area, rippled through these connections like stones dropped in still water, affecting not just the immediate victims, but the entire web of relationships that made the neighborhood more than just a collection of houses. Mrs. Dorothy Morrison had lived on Elm Street for 43 years. watching as young families moved in and raised their children. As those children grew up and eventually moved away or settled nearby to raise families of their own, she had become something of a neighborhood historian, someone who remembered when the Peterson house had been painted blue instead of its current white, who could recall which families had lived in each residence over the decades, and who served as an informal source of continuity in a community that valued both change and tradition. From her front porch, where she spent warm evenings tending to plants and observing the gentle rhythm of neighborhood life, Mrs. Morrison could see the patterns that connected individual households into a larger community. She knew which children walked to school together each morning, which neighbors helped each other with yard work and home maintenance, which families checked on elderly residents during extreme weather, and which houses served as informal gathering places for the social activities that gave the neighborhood its sense of identity. When crime touched the Riverside district, it was often Mrs. Morrison who first noticed the disruption in these normal patterns, the subtle changes that indicated something was amiss in the careful balance of community life. Her observations had assisted police investigations on several occasions, not because she was particularly vigilant about crime prevention, but because she understood the neighborhood so thoroughly that any deviation from normal patterns was immediately apparent to her experienced eye. The most significant case in recent memory had involved the Chen family, who lived in the house with the large oak tree that provided shade for much of the block during summer afternoons. Mr. and Mrs. Chen had both worked evening shifts at the local hospital, leaving their teenage daughter Jennifer alone during the dinner hours when most families were gathering around their tables. Jennifer was a responsible student who had never caused any problems, but Mrs. Morrison had begun to notice that the Chen house was attracting visitors during the hours when the parents were at work. The visitors were other teenagers, and while their presence was not necessarily problematic, Mrs. Morrison had observed that their behavior was different from the usual pattern of teenage socializing in the neighborhood. They arrived in small groups, stayed for relatively short periods, and left separately rather than together, patterns that suggested something more structured than casual friendship visits. Mrs. Morrison had not immediately contacted police, understanding that teenage social dynamics were complex and that her observations might have innocent explanations. However, when she began to notice that some of the visiting teenagers appeared to be under the influence of alcohol or drugs, and when she observed what appeared to be exchanges of money or small packages, she had decided to share her concerns with Officer Patricia Wong, who had been the community policing officer for the Riverside district for the past 7 years. Officer Wong had responded to Mrs. Morrison's report with the careful attention that characterized her approach to all community concerns. Understanding that longtime residents like Mrs. Morrison possessed a wealth of knowledge about neighborhood patterns that could be invaluable for understanding and preventing problems before they became serious. Rather than immediately launching a formal investigation, Officer Wong had begun her own discreet observations of the Chun house, looking for patterns that might confirm or contradict Mrs. Morrison's concerns. Officer Wong's surveillance had revealed that Jennifer Chun was indeed hosting regular gatherings during her parents' absence. But the nature of these gatherings was more complex than simple teenage partying. Jennifer had been providing a safe space for classmates who were dealing with various personal and family problems, creating what she called a support group for teenagers who needed someone to talk to about issues ranging from academic pressure to family conflict to questions about identity and belonging. However, some of the teenagers who attended these informal support sessions had begun bringing alcohol and marijuana, transforming what had started as peer counseling into something that could potentially create legal and safety problems for Jennifer and her family. Jennifer had been uncomfortable with the substance use, but had been reluctant to exclude people who clearly needed emotional support, creating a situation where her desire to help her friends had put her at risk of serious consequences. Officer Wong had approached the situation with characteristic sensitivity, recognizing that Jennifer's motivations were commendable even though her methods had created potential problems. Rather than treating the situation as a simple matter of underage drinking and drug use, Officer Wong had worked to understand the underlying needs that had created the informal support group and to find ways to maintain the positive aspects of what Jennifer was doing while addressing the problematic elements. The resolution had involved extensive consultation with Jennifer's parents, school counselors, and community social service agencies to develop a more structured and supervised approach to peer support that could serve the same beneficial purposes without creating legal or safety risks. Jennifer had been connected with formal training in peer counseling techniques, and the school had agreed to provide a supervised space where students could continue to meet for mutual support under appropriate adult guidance. Case had also revealed broader issues about the social and emotional needs of teenagers in the community, leading to the development of expanded youth programming that provided more opportunities for young people to receive support for the challenges they faced during adolescence. Officer Wong had worked with community organizations to create additional resources for teenagers dealing with family problems, academic stress, and other issues that had previously been addressed only through informal peer networks. Mrs. Morrison had followed the resolution of the situation with great interest, observing how the solution had strengthened rather than damaged the Kien family's standing in the neighborhood. Jennifer had continued to be respected for her desire to help her friends, while her parents had been appreciated for their cooperation in addressing the problems that had developed. The family had emerged from the experience with stronger connections to community resources and a deeper understanding of how to channel their daughter's leadership abilities in positive directions. The case had exemplified the kind of complex family and community dynamics that characterized much of the police work in residential neighborhoods, like the Riverside District. Issues that might appear to be simple matters of law enforcement often revealed deeper questions about family relationships, community support systems, and the challenges of maintaining social order while preserving individual freedom and initiative. Another family whose story had become part of the neighborhood's collective memory was the Santos household on Maple Street, where elderly Mr. Carlos Santos had been caring for his wife Maria, who suffered from Alzheimer's disease. Mr. Santos had been devoted to providing care for his wife at home rather than moving her to a specialized facility. But the demands of full-time caregiving had gradually isolated him from the social connections that had previously sustained him through difficult periods. The situation had come to police attention when neighbors had begun calling to report that Mrs. Santos was occasionally wandering away from home, appearing confused and disoriented as she walked through the neighborhood during hours when her husband was typically sleeping after his exhausting caregiving duties. The calls had been motivated by genuine concern for Mrs. Santos's safety, but they had also reflected the neighbors' uncertainty about how to help a family dealing with the challenges of aging and cognitive decline. Detective Sarah Kim had been assigned to coordinate the community's response to the Santos family situation, working with social services, medical professionals, and neighborhood volunteers to develop a comprehensive support system that would allow Mr. Santos to continue caring for his wife while ensuring her safety and maintaining the family's dignity within the Faye community. The solution had involved creating what Detective Kim described as a neighborhood safety network, an informal system of communication and mutual assistance that allowed neighbors to provide discreet support for the Santos family without intruding on their privacy or independence. Neighbors had volunteered to check on the Santos household at regular intervals, and several residents had exchanged phone numbers with Mr. Santos so that he could call for assistance if his wife wandered away or if he needed any kind of emergency help. The network had also included practical assistance with grocery shopping, transportation to medical appointments, and other daily tasks that had become difficult for Mr. Santos to manage while providing full-time care for his wife. The support had been provided quietly and efficiently, allowing the Santos family to maintain their independence while ensuring that they were not isolated during one of the most challenging periods of their lives. Detective Kim had facilitated regular meetings between the Santos family and their support network, ensuring that everyone understood their roles and responsibilities and that the assistance being provided was appropriate and helpful rather than intrusive or patronizing. The meetings had also served as opportunities for Mr. Santos to share information about his wife's condition and needs, helping neighbors understand how to interact with Mrs. Santos in ways that respected her dignity while ensuring her safety. The neighborhood safety network had been so successful that it had become a model for supporting other families dealing with similar challenges, creating a community resource that strengthened social bonds while addressing practical problems that might otherwise require formal social service intervention. The Santos family had remained in their home until Mrs. Santos's death several years later, surrounded by a community that had learned to provide support without sacrificing the family's independence or privacy. The success of the Santos support network had also revealed the extent to which neighborhood safety depended on social connections rather than just formal law enforcement. Detective Kim had observed that communities with strong informal support systems experienced fewer problems requiring police intervention, and that families who were well connected to their neighbors were less likely to experience the kind of isolation and desperation that could lead to various forms of crisis or criminal behavior. This understanding had influenced the department's approach to community policing throughout the Riverside district, with officers working to strengthen social connections and community resources rather than simply responding to problems after they had already developed. The emphasis had shifted from enforcement to prevention, from crisis response to relationship building, from individual problem solving to community capacity development. The Kim family, who lived in the house with the distinctive red door on Oak Street, had provided another example of how family circumstances could intersect with law enforcement in ways that required understanding and patience, rather than just application of rules and procedures. Mr. and Mrs. Kim had been recent immigrants who were still learning English and adapting to American customs, and their teenage son Michael had been struggling to balance his loyalty to his family's traditional values with his desire to fit in with his American classmates. The situation had come to police attention when Michael had been caught shoplifting at the local convenience store, taking items that he claimed he needed for school but that his family could not afford. The store owner had called police, but had also expressed concern about Michael's situation, noting that he was generally a polite and respectful young man who seemed to be acting out of character. Officer David Martinez had responded to the call and had quickly realized that Michael's shoplifting was a symptom of larger challenges that the Kim family was facing as they adjusted to life in a new country. Michael had been embarrassed about his family's financial struggles and had been reluctant to ask his parents for money for school supplies, knowing that they were already working multiple jobs to support the family and save money to bring other relatives to America. Officer Martinez had approached the situation with cultural sensitivity, working with community organizations that provided services to immigrant families to ensure that the Kim family was connected with appropriate resources and support. Rather than simply processing Michael through the juvenile justice system, Officer Martinez had worked to address the underlying issues that had motivated his actions. The resolution had involved connecting the Kim family with programs that provided financial assistance for school expenses, English language classes for the parents, and cultural orientation services that helped them understand American customs and institutions. Michael had been required to perform community service at the convenience store where he had shoplifted. But he had also been connected with mentoring programs that helped him navigate the challenges of growing up in a bicultural environment. The case had led to broader community discussions about how to support immigrant families and ensure that children from diverse backgrounds had equal opportunities to succeed in school and integrate into community life. The Kim family had subsequently become active participants in community organizations, with Mr. Kim serving as a volunteer translator for other immigrant families and Mrs. Kim contributing her cooking skills to community events and fundraisers. Michael had graduated from high school with honors and had received a scholarship to attend college, becoming the first member of his family to pursue higher education. Officer Martinez had maintained contact with the family over the years, watching with satisfaction as they established themselves as valued members of the community and contributed their own unique perspectives and talents to the neighborhood's cultural diversity. The Chun, Santos, and Kim families represented just a small sample of the households that made up the complex social fabric of the Riverside district, each one contributing its own story to the larger narrative of community life. Crime, when it touched these families, was rarely a simple matter of law and order, but rather an indication of underlying stresses, unmet needs, or social disconnections that required comprehensive responses rather than just legal remedies. Mrs. Morrison had observed these patterns throughout her decades in the neighborhood, watching as families faced various challenges and crises, and seeing how the community's response could either strengthen or weaken the social bonds that held everyone together. She had learned that crime prevention was really about community building, that safety came from relationships rather than just security measures, and that effective law enforcement required understanding people's circumstances rather than just enforcing rules. The Morrison family itself had faced its own challenges over the years, including a period when Mrs. Morrison's adult son had struggled with alcohol addiction and had been arrested several times for drunk driving and public intoxication. The family had been embarrassed and ashamed, feeling that they had somehow failed both their son and their community. But they had discovered that their neighbors were more supportive and understanding than they had expected. Detective Helen Wong had worked with the Morrison family to address not just the immediate legal consequences of their son's behavior, but the underlying addiction issues that had created the problems. The resolution had involved connecting the son with treatment programs, supporting the family through the difficult process of recovery, and helping them maintain their standing in the community despite the challenges they were facing. The experience had taught Mrs. Morrison that every family was vulnerable to problems that could bring them into contact with the criminal justice system, and that the community's response to these problems could either promote healing and recovery or create additional barriers to resolution. She had become an advocate for treatment-oriented approaches to crime and addiction, understanding that punishment alone was rarely sufficient to address the root causes of criminal behavior. The neighborhood's collective experience with various forms of crime and crisis had created a shared understanding that safety and security were collective responsibilities rather than individual concerns. Families had learned to look out for each other, to offer support during difficult times, and to work together to address problems before they required formal law enforcement intervention. This understanding had been tested during a series of break-ins that had occurred throughout the Riverside district during the summer months, when many families were traveling and houses were left unoccupied for extended periods. The break-ins had been carefully planned and executed, with the perpetrator apparently conducting surveillance to determine when houses would be empty and targeting valuable items. that could be easily transported and sold. The investigation had been led by Detective Robert Chun, who had worked closely with neighborhood residents to understand the patterns of the break-ins and develop strategies for prevention and apprehension. Rather than simply increasing police patrols, Detective Chun had helped organize a community watch program that utilized the existing social networks and communication systems that connected neighbors to each other. The community watch program had been more sophisticated than traditional neighborhood watch efforts, incorporating the detailed knowledge that longtime residents like Mrs. Morrison possessed about normal patterns of activity and behavior. Participants had been trained to recognize signs of suspicious activity while avoiding the kind of paranoia or vigilantism that could damage community relationships. The program had also emphasized prevention through social connection, encouraging neighbors to maintain regular communication about travel plans, home maintenance needs, and other activities that might affect the appearance and security of their properties. The goal had been to create an environment where potential criminals would find it difficult to operate unobserved, while also strengthening the social bonds that made the neighborhood a more pleasant and supportive place to live. The break-in case had been solved when Mrs. Patricia Wong, who lived in the house with the large garden on Pine Street, had observed someone conducting apparent surveillance of her neighbor's house during a time when she knew the family was out of town. Her report to police had led to the arrest of an individual who had been responsible for more than a dozen break-ins throughout the district over the previous months. The resolution of the case had strengthened rather than strained community relationships, demonstrating that residents could work effectively with law enforcement without sacrificing the trust and cooperation that made their neighborhood a desirable place to live. The Community Watch program had continued to operate long after the immediate crisis had passed, evolving into a broader network for mutual assistance and social connection. These stories of families and neighborhoods reflected the reality that crime was rarely an isolated phenomenon, but rather an indication of broader social, economic, or personal challenges that required comprehensive responses involving not just law enforcement, but also family support, community resources, and social services. The most effective solutions were those that addressed underlying causes rather than just immediate symptoms, that strengthened rather than damaged social relationships, and that promoted healing and growth rather than just punishment and exclusion. The Riverside District had learned that safety came not from walls or locks or security systems, but from the invisible threads of care and connection that linked one household to another, creating a web of mutual responsibility and support that made crime both less likely to occur and more likely to be quickly resolved when it did happen. The neighborhood had become more than just a collection of houses. It had become a community in the truest sense, a place where people looked out for each other and worked together to maintain the quality of life that made their shared space a home. The night shift at the Central Police Station began each evening at 11 o'clock, when the day officers completed their final reports and turned over their responsibilities to the smaller crew that would maintain watch over the city during the hours when most residents were sleeping peacefully in their homes. The transition happened with practiced efficiency, a choreographed handoff of information, ongoing cases, and community concerns that ensured continuity of service even as the pace and atmosphere of the station shifted into its quieter nocturnal mode. Sergeant Michael Santos had been supervising the night shift for the past 9 years, and he had developed an appreciation for the particular qualities that distinguished evening police work from the more hectic activity of daytime hours. The night shift dealt with different kinds of problems, often more personal and intimate than the business disputes and traffic accidents that characterized much of daytime police work, and the reduced staffing required officers to be more self-reliant and creative in their problem-solving approaches. The station itself took on a different character during night hours. with most of the administrative offices dark and quiet, while the essential functions of dispatch, patrol coordination, and emergency response continued in the main operation center. The fluorescent lights were dimmed to reduce glare and create a more restful atmosphere, and the constant radio chatter that characterized busy daytime shifts was replaced by the more measured communication patterns that reflected the reduced volume of calls and the increased time available for thorough response to each incident. Officer Patricia Wong had been working nights for the past 6 years, initially by choice because the schedule allowed her to attend college classes during the day, and later by preference because she had discovered that she enjoyed the pace and character of evening police work. The night shift provided more opportunities for the kind of community policing that she found most satisfying, with time for extended conversations with community members and more latitude for creative approaches to problem solving on this particular evening. As autumn rain created a gentle percussion against the station windows, Officer Wong was reviewing reports from the previous week's incidents, looking for patterns that might indicate emerging problems or opportunities for proactive intervention. The night shift was responsible not just for responding to immediate calls for service, but also for the analytical work that helped the department understand trends and develop strategies for preventing problems before they required emergency response. Report that caught her attention dealt with a series of late-night noise complaints from the Westfield apartments, where residents had been calling to report loud music and voices during the early morning hours. The complaints had been filed by different tenants on different nights, but they all seemed to involve the same apartment and similar patterns of disturbance that suggested ongoing rather than isolated problems. Officer Wong had responded to several of these calls over the past month, each time finding that the noise had stopped by the time she arrived, and that the tenant involved, a young man named David Kim, appeared genuinely surprised and apologetic about the complaints. David had explained that he worked as a freelance graphic designer and often worked late into the night on projects, sometimes with music playing to help him concentrate. But he had insisted that he kept the volume at reasonable levels and was careful not to disturb his neighbors. The pattern of complaints and responses had puzzled Officer Wong, because David seemed sincere in his efforts to be a considerate neighbor, and her observations during her visits had not revealed any evidence of excessive noise or disruptive behavior. However, the complaints had continued to come in from different neighbors at different times, suggesting that there was some disconnect between David's perception of his activities and his neighbor's experience of the noise they were creating. Officer Wong had decided to investigate the situation more thoroughly, spending several hours during her patrol shift positioned where she could observe the Westfield apartments during the late evening hours when the complaints typically occurred. Her surveillance had revealed an unexpected explanation for the recurring problems. David's apartment was located directly below the building's heating and ventilation system, and the mechanical noise from this equipment was being amplified and transmitted through the building's structure in ways that made it seem like the noise was coming from his apartment. The apparent noise complaints were actually complaints about mechanical noise from the building's aging HVAC system, but the way sound traveled through the building had made it seem to residents that the disturbance was coming from David's apartment rather than from the mechanical systems located above it. David had been unaware of this acoustic phenomenon because the noise was less noticeable inside his apartment than it was in the surrounding units, where the transmitted vibrations were creating the disturbance that prompted the complaints. Officer Wong's investigation had required consultation with building maintenance personnel and acoustic engineers to understand the technical aspects of how sound and vibration were being transmitted through the building structure. The solution had involved adjustments to the HVAC system's operating schedule and the installation of vibration dampening materials. that reduced the transmission of mechanical noise to residential units. Case had been resolved without any formal legal action, but it had required Officer Wong to serve as a mediator between frustrated residents, a confused tenant, and building management that had been unaware of the technical problems affecting their property. The resolution had improved relationships between all parties while addressing the underlying mechanical issues that had been creating the problems. Officer Wong's approach to the case demonstrated the kind of thorough investigation and creative problem-solving that characterized much of the night shift's work, where officers had time to dig deeper into complex situations and develop comprehensive solutions, rather than just responding to immediate crises. The night shift provided opportunities for the kind of community policing that addressed root causes rather than just symptoms, that strengthened relationships rather than just enforcing rules. Another case that had occupied considerable attention during recent night shifts involved Detective Sarah Chun's investigation of a series of vandalism incidents at Roosevelt High School. Someone had been spray painting messages on school buildings during the overnight hours, creating what school administrators described as an ongoing maintenance problem and a source of concern about security and student behavior. Detective Chun had been working with the night shift to coordinate surveillance of the school property, trying to identify the person or persons responsible for the graffiti, while also attempting to understand the motivations behind the messages being painted. The graffiti was not random or destructive in nature, but consisted of carefully planned messages dealing with social and political issues that suggested serious thought and genuine conviction rather than simple vandalism or rebellious acting out. The messages dealt with topics like environmental protection, social justice, and educational equity, and they were written in articulate language that demonstrated both intelligence and passion about the issues being addressed. Detective Chen had begun to suspect that the graffiti represented an attempt at political expression rather than mere destruction of property, and she had been working to understand what circumstances might have motivated someone to choose illegal means for communicating about these important social issues. Surveillance operation had finally been successful when Officer Martinez, during a routine patrol of the school grounds, had observed a figure working on one of the buildings during the early morning hours. Rather than immediately making an arrest, Officer Martinez had chosen to observe the graffiti creation process, documenting the care and artistic skill that the unknown person was bringing to their work and the thoughtful way they selected locations and planned their messages. The vandal had turned out to be Mrs. Helen Santos, a substitute teacher who had been frustrated by what she perceived as the school district's reluctance to address controversial social and political issues in the curriculum. Mrs. Santos had been creating the graffiti as a way of forcing conversations about topics that she felt were essential for students to understand, but that were being avoided because of their controversial nature. Detective Chun had approached Mrs. Santos with understanding rather than immediate legal action, recognizing that her motivations were educational rather than destructive, and that her methods, while inappropriate, were motivated by genuine concern for student learning and social awareness. The case had been resolved through a collaborative process that addressed both Mrs. Santos's desire to promote important discussions and the school's need to maintain appropriate boundaries around political expression in educational settings. The resolution had involved Mrs. Santos working with school administrators and community leaders to develop a series of community forums where controversial social and political issues could be discussed in appropriate settings that encourage dialogue rather than confrontation. Mrs. Santos had also been connected with opportunities to volunteer with community organizations that were working on the social justice issues that motivated her activism. The case had demonstrated how night shift investigations could reveal complex motivations behind apparently simple crimes, and how patient detective work could lead to solutions that addressed underlying causes rather than just punishing immediate symptoms. Detective Chun's approach had transformed what could have been a straightforward vandalism prosecution into an opportunity for community education and civic engagement. Night Shift also dealt with the quieter aspects of ongoing investigations, including the careful documentation and analysis work that was essential for understanding patterns and developing effective responses to recurring problems. Detective Robert Martinez spent many of his night shift hours reviewing case files, looking for connections between apparently unrelated incidents, and developing comprehensive reports that helped the department understand trends and allocate resources effectively. One pattern that had emerged from Detective Martinez's analysis was a series of small thefts from local businesses that occurred during the late evening hours when stores were closing and staff were focused on end-of-day procedures. The thefts were modest in scope, involving items like food, clothing, and personal care products that suggested someone was taking necessities rather than valuables that could be sold for profit. The pattern had been difficult to detect initially because each individual theft was small and occurred at different businesses, creating losses that were not significant enough to prompt major investigations, but that collectively represented a recurring problem affecting multiple members of the local business community. Detective Martinez's analysis had revealed that the thefts were occurring in a geographic pattern that suggested a single person or small group was responsible for all of the incidents. Detective Martinez had coordinated with local business owners to develop a better understanding of when and how the thefts were occurring, working with store managers to review security footage and identify common factors that might lead to the identification of the person or persons responsible. The investigation had required patience and careful attention to detail, as the perpetrator was clearly intelligent and careful to avoid detection, while systematically targeting businesses throughout the commercial district. The case had been solved when Mrs. Dorothy Kim, the manager of Morrison's Pharmacy, had recognized the person responsible as someone she had seen in her store on several occasions, but who had never made any purchases. The individual was Mrs. Maria Wong, an elderly woman who had been experiencing financial difficulties after her husband's death and who had been too proud to ask for assistance from social services or family members. Mrs. Wong had been taking small quantities of necessary items like medications, food, and personal care products that she could not afford to purchase legitimately. But her thefts had been motivated by need rather than greed and had been carefully limited to avoid causing significant financial harm to the businesses involved. Detective Martinez had approached the case with sensitivity to Mrs. Wong's circumstances while also addressing the legitimate concerns of business owners who could not absorb ongoing losses regardless of their sympathy for individual situations. The resolution had involved connecting Mrs. Wong with appropriate social services and community assistance programs while also developing a system that allowed her to obtain necessary items through legitimate channels. Several of the affected businesses had worked with Detective Martinez to create an informal assistance program that provided support for elderly community members who were experiencing financial difficulties, transforming the individual case into a broader community response to the challenges of aging and poverty. The night shift had also been responsible for coordinating with other law enforcement agencies on cases that crossed jurisdictional boundaries or involved complex investigations requiring multiple resources. Officer David Wong had been working with state, police, and federal authorities on a case involving suspicious financial transactions that had been detected by local banks and that might indicate money laundering or other forms of financial crime. The case had required careful coordination between different levels of law enforcement, with each agency contributing specific expertise and resources while maintaining communication about developments and findings. Officer Wong's role had been to serve as a liaison between the federal investigation and local community concerns, ensuring that the broader investigation did not disrupt local business operations or community relationships unnecessarily. The investigation had ultimately revealed that the suspicious financial activities were related to a legitimate business that was operating in compliance with all applicable laws, but that had unusual transaction patterns due to the international nature of its operations. The case had been closed without any criminal charges, but the investigation had strengthened relationships between local and federal law enforcement agencies and had improved procedures for handling similar cases in the future. Officer Wong's work on the case had demonstrated how night shift officers often dealt with complex cases that required specialized knowledge and interagency coordination, responsibilities that went well beyond traditional patrol duties and that required sophisticated understanding of legal and procedural issues. The night shift provided opportunities for officers to develop expertise in specialized areas while maintaining their connection to community policing and local concerns. The station's communications center was the nerve center of night shift operations, where dispatchers maintained constant contact with patrol officers while also coordinating with other emergency services and monitoring various communication systems that kept the department connected to the broader public safety network. Dispatcher Helen Chun had been working nights for the past 8 years, and she had developed an intimate knowledge of the city's geography, the personalities and capabilities of individual officers, and the patterns of activity that characterize different neighborhoods during overnight hours. Dispatcher Chun's work required not just technical competence in operating communication equipment, but also the interpersonal skills necessary for managing the human aspects of emergency response, including calming frightened callers, coordinating between multiple agencies, and maintaining morale among officers who were working in isolation during the overnight hours. Her role was essential for maintaining the coordination and communication that made effective police work possible. On this particular night, Dispatcher Chen was monitoring several ongoing situations simultaneously, including a domestic dispute that Officer Santos was handling in the Riverside District, a traffic accident that required coordination with fire and medical services, and a burglary alarm that had turned out to be a false activation, but that had required investigation to ensure that no actual crime had occurred. The coordination of these multiple incidents required careful attention to priorities and resources, ensuring that the most serious situations received adequate attention while also maintaining coverage for routine patrol duties and emergency response capability. Dispatcher Chun's work exemplified the behind-the-scenes coordination that made all other police work possible, providing the communication infrastructure that allowed individual officers to function as part of a coordinated team. The night shift represented a different approach to police work, one that emphasized thorough investigation, community relationship building, and preventive problem-solving over rapid response and crisis management. The reduced pace and increased time available during overnight hours allowed officers to engage more deeply with complex situations, to develop comprehensive solutions rather than quick fixes, and to build the kind of community relationships that made crime prevention possible. As the night shift settled into its steady rhythm, with officers conducting their patrols, dispatchers maintaining their communication networks, and detectives pursuing their investigations, the station embodied the principle that public safety was an ongoing commitment rather than just a response to crisis. The night shift maintained the continuous vigilance that allowed the community to sleep peacefully, knowing that their safety was being protected by dedicated professionals who understood that effective police work was as much about prevention as it was about response. The quiet hours of the night shift provided space for reflection and analysis, for the kind of thoughtful police work that addressed root causes rather than just immediate symptoms, and for the relationship building that made communities safer through cooperation rather than just enforcement. In the gentle rhythm of night shift work, the essential nature of police service revealed itself. The patient, professional dedication to maintaining the social order that made civilized life possible. The evidence room occupied the entire third floor of the old administrative building. Its rows of metal shelving extending into dim corners where fluorescent lights hummed their eternal tune over cardboard boxes and manila envelopes that contained the physical remnants of decades of police work. Among these carefully cataloged materials, the photograph collection held a special place, preserving visual records of crime scenes, evidence, and community events that had shaped the department's understanding of its role within the broader social fabric of the city. Detective Margaret Torres had been assigned to oversee the digitization of the photograph archive, a project that would preserve these historical images while making them more accessible for current investigations and research. The work required careful handling of fragile materials, many of them dating back to the 1950s when police photography had been conducted with large format cameras that produced detailed black and white images of remarkable clarity and artistic quality. The photographs told stories that went beyond the official reports they had been created to support, capturing moments of human drama and community life that revealed the texture of daily existence during different eras of the city's history. Each image was a window into a specific time and place, preserving details about clothing, architecture, social customs, and urban development that provided context for understanding how crime and law enforcement had evolved over the decades. The earliest photographs in the collection dated from 1952, when the department had first acquired professional camera equipment and had begun systematically documenting crime scenes and evidence. These images possessed a formal quality that reflected the technical constraints of the equipment available at that time, with careful attention to lighting and composition that gave even routine evidence photographs an artistic dignity that was rarely seen in contemporary police photography. 1. Series of photographs that had captured Detective Torres's attention documented a Kofa vandalism case from the summer of 1954, when someone had been painting elaborate murals on the sides of buildings throughout the downtown commercial district. The photograph showed not just the completed artworks, but also the progression of their creation, suggesting that the investigating officer had been observing and documenting the process over several weeks rather than simply recording the final results. The murals depicted scenes of local history, with careful attention to architectural details and historical accuracy, that suggested extensive research and genuine artistic talent. The vandal had been transforming blank walls into historical narratives that celebrated the community's past and highlighted the contributions of various ethnic groups and social movements that had shaped the city's development. The photographs revealed the high quality of the artwork and the thoughtful way it had been integrated into the existing urban landscape, working with rather than against the architectural features of the buildings where it appeared. The murals had clearly been created by someone with both artistic training and deep knowledge of local history, someone who was using the legal means to achieve what were essentially educational and cultural goals. Case file that accompanied the photographs documented how Officer James Kim had approached the investigation with unusual patience and creativity, recognizing that the murals represented something more complex than simple vandalism. Rather than immediately seeking to arrest the unknown artist, Officer Kim had worked to understand the motivations behind the work and to find ways to channel the artistic energy into legal venues that could serve the same community education purposes. The photographs showed the eventual resolution of the case, when the murals had been incorporated into an official public art program that recognized their historical and artistic value while establishing proper procedures for future public art projects. The unknown artist had been revealed as Mrs. Elena Santos, a retired history teacher who had been frustrated by the lack of public recognition for the diverse cultural contributions that had made the city's development. POSSIBLE, Mrs. Santos had worked with city officials and community organizations to develop a comprehensive public art program that included not just her historical murals but also works by other local artists who were interested in celebrating and preserving the community's cultural heritage. The photographs documented the transformation of what had begun as a law enforcement problem into a community cultural resource that continued to benefit residents and visitors decades later. Detective Torres found these older photographs fascinating not just for their historical content, but for the way they revealed different approaches to police work that had characterized earlier eras. The photographers who had created these images had clearly understood their work as more than just technical documentation, bringing an artistic sensibility to their task that elevated routine police photography into something approaching fine art. Another series of photographs that had drawn her attention documented a missing person case from the winter of 1957, when a local businessman named Robert Morrison had disappeared during a snowstorm while driving home from a late business meeting. The photograph showed the search efforts that had been conducted over several days, with images of rescue teams, search dogs, and community volunteers who had participated in the effort to locate Mr. Morrison and his vehicle. The photographs captured not just the technical aspects of the search operation, but also the human dimension of community response to crisis, showing neighbors working together to help a family in distress and law enforcement officers going beyond their normal duties to provide comfort and support during a difficult time. The images revealed the winter landscape in remarkable detail, preserving the appearance of the city during a particularly severe weather event that had tested the community's resilience and mutual support systems. The case had been resolved when Mr. Morrison's vehicle had been found in a snowdrift approximately 2 miles from his intended route, where he had apparently become disoriented during the blizzard and had driven off the road into an area where his car was not visible from the highway. Mr. Morrison had survived the incident, and the photographs documented his rescue and reunion with his family, capturing moments of relief and gratitude that spoke to the importance of community cooperation in emergency situations. Final photographs in the series showed the community celebration that had been organized to thank the volunteers who had participated in the search effort, an event that had strengthened social bonds and established precedents for mutual assistance that continued to characterize the community's response to future emergencies. The case had demonstrated how law enforcement could serve as a catalyst for community building, rather than just a provider of technical services. Detective Torres had been particularly struck by the photograph of Mrs. Morrison embracing Officer David long after her husband's safe return, an image that captured the emotional significance of police work beyond its technical and legal aspects. The photograph showed how law enforcement officers often became integral parts of the communities they served, sharing in both the sorrows and joys of the families whose lives they touched through their professional duties. Moving forward in time, Detective Torres examined photographs from the 1960s that documented the changing nature of crime and community life during a period of significant social and cultural transformation. These images revealed shifts in clothing styles, architectural trends, and social customs that provided context for understanding how law enforcement had adapted to changing community needs and Expectations. One particularly extensive series of photographs from 1963 documented a case involving allegations of illegal gambling at Morrison's Pool Hall, a popular gathering place for working-class men who used the establishment as an informal social club where they could relax after work and maintain friendships that had often been formed during their military service in World War II and the Korean War. The photographs showed the pool hall's interior in remarkable detail, capturing not just the physical layout of the establishment, but also the social atmosphere that had made it an important community institution. The images revealed the careful way the space had been arranged to promote conversation and camaraderie, with comfortable seating areas, good lighting for reading newspapers and magazines, and display cases containing memorabilia from local sports teams and military units. The investigation had been prompted by complaints from local religious leaders who were concerned about gambling activities that they believed were corrupting community morals and providing opportunities for organized crime to establish a foothold in their neighborhood. The photographs documented Detective Helen Santos's thorough investigation of these allegations, including surveillance images that showed the activities that were actually taking place in the establishment. Detective Santos's investigation had revealed that while some informal betting was occurring among the pool hall's patrons, the activities were more social than commercial in nature, involving small wagers between friends rather than organized gambling operations. The photographs showed card games, pool tournaments, and sports viewing events where modest betting was taking place, but also documented the broader social functions that the establishment served for its community of regular customers. The resolution of the case had involved working with the pool hall's owner to eliminate the betting activities while preserving the social functions that made the establishment valuable to its patrons. The photographs showed the changes that had been implemented, including new rules about gambling and modifications to the physical space that discouraged betting while maintaining the atmosphere that attracted customers who valued the establishment as a social gathering place. The case had demonstrated how law enforcement could address legitimate community concerns while preserving valuable social institutions that served important functions beyond those that had created legal problems. Detective Santos's patient approach had allowed the pool hall to continue operating as a community resource while eliminating the activities that had prompted complaints from other community members. Detective Torres found that the photographs from this era often revealed complex social dynamics that were not fully captured in the written reports, showing how law enforcement officers had navigated between competing community interests and values while maintaining their commitment to fair and impartial enforcement of the law. The images provided visual evidence of the interpersonal skills and cultural sensitivity that had characterized effective police work during periods of social change and tension. The 1970s photographs in the collection reflected the continued evolution of police work and community life, with images that documented new types of crimes and social problems, while also showing how law enforcement had adapted its approaches to address changing community needs. These photographs often had a more informal quality than the highly stylized images from earlier decades, reflecting changes in photographic technology and techniques that allowed for more spontaneous and naturalistic documentation. One series of photographs from 1974 documented a shoplifting case at Wong's department store that had evolved into something much more complex than routine retail theft. The images showed Mrs. Patricia Kim, a 67-year-old widow who had been observed taking items from the store without paying for them, but who appeared confused and distressed rather than deliberately criminal in her behavior. The photographs captured the careful way that Officer Robert Martinez had handled the situation, working with store management and Mrs. Kim's family to understand the circumstances that had led to her actions. The images showed Mrs. Kim's obvious confusion and the gentle way that Officer Martinez had interviewed her, recognizing that her behavior might be a symptom of medical problems rather than criminal intent. The investigation had revealed that Mrs. Kim was experiencing early-stage dementia that was affecting her judgment and memory, causing her to take items without remembering to pay for them or even realizing that she had taken them. The photographs documented the collaborative approach that Officer Martinez had developed with Mrs. Kim's family and her doctor to address both the immediate incident and the broader challenges that her medical condition was creating. The resolution had involved connecting Mrs. Kim with appropriate medical care and social services while also working with the store to prevent future incidents through increased awareness and modified procedures for dealing with customers who might be experiencing cognitive impairments. The photograph showed the community meeting that had been organized to educate local business owners about recognizing and responding to signs of dementia and other age-related conditions that could affect customer behavior. The case had established procedures that protected both elderly community members and local businesses, creating a model that had been adopted by other retailers throughout the city. The photographs documented the training sessions that had been conducted for store employees, showing how law enforcement had worked with the business community to address social problems through education and cooperation rather than just enforcement and punishment. Detective Torres observed how the photographs from this era often showed law enforcement officers working in partnership with other community institutions and service providers, reflecting an understanding that crime and social problems required comprehensive responses that went beyond traditional police work. The images revealed the collaborative relationships that had developed between police officers and social workers, medical professionals, educators, and community leaders. The 1980s photographs in the collection reflected further changes in police work and community life, with images that documented new types of technology and investigative techniques while also showing continued emphasis on community, partnerships, and problem-solving approaches. These photographs often had better technical quality than earlier images, reflecting improvements in camera equipment and photographic materials that allowed for more detailed and accurate documentation. One particularly comprehensive series of photographs from 1986 documented a case involving credit card fraud that had affected several local businesses and had required coordination between local police and federal agencies with expertise in financial crimes. The images showed the complex investigation process, including surveillance photographs, evidence documentation, and meetings between different law enforcement agencies. The photographs revealed the sophisticated nature of the fraud scheme, which had involved the creation of false identification documents and the systematic exploitation of weaknesses in the credit card verification systems that were being used by local merchants. The images showed how Detective Maria Wong had worked with federal investigators to understand the technical aspects of the scheme, while also maintaining focus on the local community impacts that were within her jurisdiction. The case had been solved through a combination of traditional detective work and new technological approaches to evidence analysis, and the photographs documented both the investigative techniques and the collaborative relationships between different levels of law enforcement that had made the resolution possible. The images showed how local police officers had learned to work effectively with federal agencies while maintaining their primary commitment to serving their own communities. The photographs also documented the community education efforts that had followed the resolution of the case, showing presentations to local business owners about fraud prevention techniques and the development of improved procedures for verifying customer identification and credit card validity. The case had strengthened relationships between law enforcement and the business community, while also improving security practices that benefited everyone involved. As Detective Torres continued her work with the photograph archive, she found herself developing a deeper appreciation for the historical evolution of police work and its relationship to broader social and technological changes. The images provided a visual record of how law enforcement had adapted to new challenges while maintaining its fundamental commitment to serving community needs and protecting public safety. The photographs also revealed the personal relationships and human connections that had always been at the heart of effective police work, showing how individual officers had built trust and cooperation within their communities through patient, professional service that went beyond simple enforcement of laws and regulations. The images captured moments of genuine human interaction that had made the difference between mere rule enforcement and true community service. The evidence room's photograph collection stood as a testament to the Kifa, dedicated work of generations of police officers who had understood that their responsibilities extended beyond immediate crisis response to include the broader work of maintaining social order and community well-being. Each image preserved a moment when law enforcement had intersected with ordinary community life, creating opportunities for positive change and mutual understanding. The digitization project would ensure that these historical images remained accessible for future generations, preserving not just the technical record of police work, but also the visual documentation of how communities had evolved and how law enforcement had adapted to serve changing needs while maintaining its core values of professionalism, integrity, and service to others. In the quiet atmosphere of the evidence room, surrounded by the accumulated records of decades of police work, Detective Torres felt connected to the long tradition of dedicated public service that these photographs represented. Each image was a reminder that effective law enforcement required not just technical skills and legal knowledge, but also the human qualities of patience, empathy, and genuine concern for community welfare that had characterized the best police work throughout the department's history. The corner of 5th and Main Street looked unremarkable on this quiet autumn evening, with its small cluster of local businesses settling into the gentle rhythm of closing time. The streetlights cast their familiar pools of warm light on sidewalks that had been walked by thousands of residents over the decades, each footstep adding to the accumulated history that lived in the very pavement of the city's most ordinary places. Yet this intersection held within its memory a dozen stories of crime and resolution, each one contributing to the invisible archive that made the city more than just a collection of buildings and streets. Detective Robert Chun had been walking these streets for 22 years, first as a patrol officer and now as a senior detective whose understanding of the city extended beyond its current appearance to encompass the layers of history that had shaped each neighborhood, each business district, each residential area where families had built their lives over generations. He knew which buildings had housed significant investigations, which street corners had witnessed important arrests, which parks and public spaces had been transformed by the patient work of community policing that addressed problems before they became crises. The building that now housed Morrison's bakery had been the site of a complex embezzlement case in 1987, when the previous occupant, a small accounting firm, had been the focus of an investigation into missing funds from several local nonprofit organizations. The case had required months of careful financial analysis to understand how the theft had been concealed within legitimate business transactions, and had ultimately been solved through the kind of methodical detective work that relied more on patience and attention to detail than on dramatic investigative techniques. Detective Chun remembered the case not for its complexity or its financial significance, but for the way its resolution had strengthened rather than damaged the relationships between the affected organizations and the broader business community. The investigation had revealed weaknesses in financial oversight procedures that were common to many small organizations, leading to the development of training, programs and support services that had prevented similar problems. In other businesses and nonprofits throughout the city, the building itself had been transformed by its new occupants, with the former offices converted into a commercial kitchen and retail space that served not just as a bakery, but as an informal community gathering place where neighbors could meet for coffee and conversation. The space that had once contained filing cabinets full of financial records now held display cases filled with fresh bread and pastries, representing a kind of rehabilitation that extended beyond the legal resolution of the original crime to encompass the positive reuse of a space that had been tainted by wrongdoing. Walking past the bakery's warm windows, Detective Chun could see Mrs. Patricia Santos arranging tomorrow's display of baked goods. Her careful attention to presentation, reflecting the pride and professionalism that had made the business a valued part of the neighborhood's commercial life. The transformation of the space from a site of financial crime to a source of community nourishment represented the kind of healing that was possible when places were allowed to develop new purposes and new meanings that honored their history while moving beyond their problems. Continuing down Main Street, Detective Chun passed the small park that had been the focus of a vandalism investigation in 1991, when someone had been systematically damaging the playground equipment and benches that had been installed through a community fundraising effort. The vandalism had been particularly troubling because it had targeted a space that represented the community's investment in its children and families, undermining the sense of shared ownership and pride that had motivated the original improvement project. The case had been solved when Officer Margaret Torres, who had been assigned to increase patrols in the area, had observed the vandalism being committed by a group of teenagers who were expressing anger about their exclusion from the community activities that had led to the park's renovation. The young people had felt that the improvement project had ignored their interests and needs, focusing on younger children and families while providing nothing for teenagers who also needed safe and interesting places to spend their time. Officer Torres had approached the situation as an opportunity for community building rather than just law enforcement, working with the teenagers to understand their concerns and to find ways to address their legitimate needs for recreational opportunities and social recognition. The resolution had involved expanding the park to include facilities that appealed to older youth, while also creating volunteer opportunities that allowed the teenagers to contribute to the community rather than feeling excluded from it. The park now served all age groups within the neighborhood, with playground equipment for small children, sports facilities for teenagers, and comfortable seating areas for adults and elderly residents who enjoyed watching the activities or simply spending time outdoors. The space that had once been a source of conflict had become a symbol of successful community problem-solving, demonstrating how patient investigation and creative thinking could transform criminal incidents into opportunities for positive change. Detective Chun paused at the bench where he'd often seen Mr. David Kim reading his newspaper during pleasant weather, remembering how Mr. Kim had been one of the community volunteers who had worked with Officer Torres to develop the expanded recreational programming that had resolved the vandalism problem. The bench itself had been one of the items that had been damaged during the original incidents, but it had been repaired and reinforced as part of the community's response to the crime, making it stronger and more durable than it had been originally. The intersection of Maple and 3rd Street held memories of a different kind of investigation, one that had revealed the complex relationship between mental health issues and behavior that might appear criminal, but that actually reflected medical conditions requiring treatment rather than punishment. The small apartment building on the corner had been the home of Mrs. Helen Wong, whose neighbors had repeatedly called police to report strange noises and apparent disturbances coming from her unit during the late evening hours. Detective Sarah Kim had been assigned to investigate the complaints, initially approaching the situation as a possible domestic violence case or illegal activity that was disturbing the peaceful residential environment. However, her investigation had revealed that Mrs. Wong was experiencing auditory hallucinations related to an undiagnosed mental health condition, and that the noises that concerned her neighbors were actually Mrs. Wong's responses to voices that only she could hear. The case had required Detective Kim to work with mental health professionals, social services, and Mrs. Wong's family to develop a comprehensive treatment plan that addressed her medical needs while also resolving the neighbors' concerns about the disturbances. The resolution had involved connecting Mrs. Wong with appropriate psychiatric care and medication management, while also educating her neighbors about mental health issues and the importance of responding with compassion rather than fear to people who were struggling with psychological challenges. That Mrs. Wong had subsequently become an advocate for mental health awareness within her apartment building and the broader neighborhood, sharing her story to help others understand that many behaviors that might seem frightening or antisocial were actually symptoms of treatable medical conditions. The building where she lived had developed informal support systems for residents who were dealing with various health challenges, creating a more inclusive and caring community environment. Detective Chun had observed similar transformations throughout the city, where spaces that had been sites of crime or conflict had evolved into places that embodied the community's capacity for healing, understanding, and positive change. The city had become a living archive of successful problem solving. With each renovated building, each improved public space, each strengthened neighborhood representing the accumulated wisdom that came from addressing problems constructively rather than simply punishing wrongdoing. The old warehouse district, now converted into artist studios and small manufacturing businesses, had once been the focus of a major investigation into illegal dumping that had threatened the environmental health of the surrounding neighborhoods. The investigation had revealed that several businesses were disposing of hazardous materials improperly, creating contamination that could have had serious long-term effects on air and water quality throughout the area. Asterisk. Detective Martinez had worked with environmental agencies and community health organizations to address not just the immediate illegal dumping, but the broader issues of environmental justice and industrial responsibility that the case had revealed. The resolution had involved comprehensive cleanup of the contaminated areas, new regulations for waste disposal, and the development of monitoring systems that ensured ongoing environmental protection. The transformation of the warehouse district into a hub for creative and sustainable businesses had been a direct result of the environmental remediation that had followed the illegal dumping investigation. The cleaned and renovated buildings now housed artists, craftspeople, and small manufacturers who were committed to environmentally responsible practices, creating a business district that served as a model for sustainable urban development. Walking through the converted warehouse district on quiet evenings, Detective Chun could see the evidence of successful environmental restoration in the healthy trees that had been planted along the streets, the clean waterways that flowed through the area, and the vibrant community of businesses and residents who had chosen to locate there because of its reputation for environmental responsibility and creative energy. The Riverside District held its own collection of archived stories, with houses and streets that had been sites of various investigations over the years, each one contributing to the neighborhood's evolution into one of the city's most stable and supportive residential areas. The sense of community safety that characterized the district was not the result of heavy police presence or security measures, but rather the outcome of decades of patient community building that had addressed problems through cooperation and mutual support. The house with the large front garden on Oak Street had been the focus of a noise complaint investigation in 1994. when neighbors had reported loud arguments and possible domestic violence. Officer Helen Santos had discovered that the apparent violence was actually an elderly couple dealing with the husband's advancing dementia, which was causing confusion and agitation that sometimes led to loud outbursts that sounded threatening to people who could not see what was actually happening. Officer Santos had worked with the couple's family and medical professionals to develop care strategies that addressed the husband's medical needs while also providing support for his wife, who had been struggling to provide care without adequate resources or knowledge about dementia management. The resolution had involved connecting the family with appropriate medical and social services, while also educating neighbors about dementia and its effects on behavior. The house had subsequently become known throughout the neighborhood as a resource for families dealing with aging and health challenges, with the wife becoming an informal counselor for other caregivers who were facing similar situations. The front garden had been expanded over the years through the volunteer efforts of neighbors who wanted to contribute to the beauty of the space while also providing practical support for the family during difficult times. Detective Chun had often observed how individual cases of crime or conflict could become catalysts for broader community improvements, with the investigation and resolution process revealing underlying needs or problems that affected multiple families, but that had not been previously recognized or addressed. The city's neighborhoods had been strengthened through this process of identifying and solving problems collectively rather than leaving individual families to struggle alone with challenges that were actually quite common. The commercial district along 4th Street held memories of several investigations that had revealed the importance of supporting small businesses and maintaining the economic diversity that made neighborhoods vibrant and sustainable. A series of break-ins during the late 1990s had threatened several family-owned businesses that provided essential services to their communities while also serving as informal gathering places where neighbors could maintain social connections. Detective Wong had approached the investigation not just as a matter of catching the perpetrators, but as an opportunity to strengthen the business district's security and community support systems. The resolution had involved not only arresting the individuals responsible for the break-ins, but also developing improved lighting, better communication systems between businesses, and increased community involvement in supporting local commerce. The business district had subsequently become a model for community-supported commercial development, with residents actively choosing to shop locally and participate in business district events that strengthened both economic sustainability and social connections. The break-ins that had initially threatened the area's viability had ultimately led to innovations in community economic development that had been adopted by other neighborhoods throughout the city. Detective Chun paused outside Morrison's Hardware, where he could see Mr. Anthony Kim organizing inventory for the next day's business. His methodical attention to detail reflecting the kind of professional pride that had made the store a community institution for more than 30 years. The store had been one of the businesses affected by the 1990s break-ins, but its recovery and continued success represented the resilience that characterized the entire business district. The elementary school on Pine Street had been the site of a vandalism investigation in 2001, when someone had been spray painting graffiti on the building's exterior walls during weekend hours. The investigation had revealed that the vandalism was being committed by a former student who was expressing anger about his negative experiences in the school system and his sense that educational institutions had failed to recognize his potential or address his learning needs. Detective Torres had worked with school administrators, the former student, and his family to develop a resolution that addressed both the immediate vandalism problem and the underlying educational and social issues that had motivated the destructive behavior. The resolution had involved the development of alternative educational programs for students who had difficulty succeeding in traditional classroom settings, while also creating opportunities for former students to contribute positively to the school community. The school had subsequently become known for its innovative approaches to serving students with diverse learning needs and its strong connections to community members who provided mentoring and support services. The building that had been vandalized had been renovated to include new facilities for alternative education programs, while the exterior walls had been converted into a community art project that involved both current and former students in creating positive visual representations of educational success and community pride. These stories were embedded in the very architecture and landscape of the city. Detective Chun reflected as he completed his evening walk through the downtown area. Each building, each street corner, each public space held within its memory the evidence of crimes that had been transformed into opportunities for community improvement. Conflicts that had been resolved through patient understanding rather than just legal action, and problems that had become catalysts for positive change. The city had become its own archive of successful problem solving, with the physical environment serving as a permanent record of the community's capacity for healing, growth, and transformation. The places that had once been sites of crime or conflict had evolved into symbols of the collective wisdom that came from addressing problems constructively and learning from difficult experiences rather than simply trying to forget them or punish them out of existence. Walking through these streets in the quiet evening hours, when the day's activities had settled into the peaceful rhythm of night, Detective Chun could feel the accumulated weight of all the positive changes that had emerged from decades of thoughtful police work and community cooperation. The city held within its landscape the evidence that crime and conflict, when approached with patience and creativity, could become opportunities for building stronger, more caring, and more resilient communities. The archive lived not in filing cabinets or computer databases, but in the improved neighborhoods, the strengthened businesses, the more supportive social services, and the deeper community connections that had emerged from the patient work of transforming problems into solutions. The city itself had become a testament to the possibility that law enforcement could serve not just as a response to crime, but as a catalyst for the kind of positive change that made crime less likely to occur in communities, better able to support all of their members. In the gentle glow of streetlights and the quiet rhythm of evening settling over the city, Detective Chen felt the satisfaction that came from being part of this ongoing work of community building, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, but also new opportunities to contribute to the collective project of making their shared home a place where everyone could live safely, peacefully, and with dignity. The final archive room sat at the very end of the basement corridor, behind a heavy door marked simply closed cases, permanent storage. Here, in the deepest quiet of the building's foundation, rested the files that had completed their journey through the machinery of justice, cases that had been investigated, resolved, and sealed with the satisfaction that came from problems solved and communities made whole again. The air here held a different quality than in the active archives, a sense of completion and rest that seemed to emanate from thousands of stories that had found their proper endings. Chief of Police Margaret Morrison made her monthly visit to this final archive on the last Friday of each month, a ritual she had maintained for the past 8 years of her tenure. The walk through these rows of completed cases served as both a meditation on the nature of her profession and a reminder of the fundamental purpose that guided all police work: the patient transformation of conflict into peace, of problems into solutions, of community wounds into community strength. The shelving here extended back into shadows that the overhead lighting could not quite penetrate, creating corners where the oldest files rested in a darkness that spoke not of neglect, but of the deep rest that came to stories that had been fully told, completely resolved, and properly archived for the instruction of future generations. Each box, each file, each carefully labeled folder represented a moment when the abstract principles of law and order had been successfully applied to the specific complexities of human behavior and community life. Chief Morrison paused at a cabinet labeled Community Resolution Cases, 1995 to 2000, pulling out a thick file that contained the documentation of what had become known throughout the department as the Morrison Elementary School case. Though it had involved far more than just the school itself, the case had begun with reports of recurring vandalism at the school, but had evolved into a comprehensive community intervention that had addressed underlying issues of youth alienation, family stress, and neighborhood social disconnection. The file contained not just the initial incident reports and investigation notes, but also the documentation of the 18-month process that had transformed a recurring crime problem into a model program for community-based crime prevention. The vandalism had been committed by a group of middle school students who had been expressing their frustration with academic failure, family problems, and a general sense of disconnection from adult society. Detective David Wong had approached the case not as a simple matter of arresting juvenile offenders, but as an opportunity to understand and address the social conditions that were creating these expressions of anger and alienation. His investigation had revealed that the vandalism was a symptom of broader problems affecting many families in the neighborhood, including economic stress, educational challenges, and a lack of structured opportunities for young people to contribute positively to their community. The resolution had involved creating what became known as the Community Schools Project, a comprehensive program that used school facilities as community centers during evening and weekend hours, providing educational support, recreational opportunities, and social services for families throughout the neighborhood. The project had been designed not just to prevent vandalism, but to address the underlying needs that had motivated the destructive behavior. The file contained letters from dozens of families who had participated in the Community Schools Project over the years, expressing gratitude for the educational opportunities, the social connections, and the practical support that had helped them navigate various challenges and crises. The project had prevented not just vandalism, but also more serious forms of juvenile crime, while strengthening family relationships and community bonds that made the entire neighborhood safer and more supportive for all residents. Chief Morrison read through the final report on the case, noting how Detective Wong had documented not just the immediate resolution of the vandalism problem, but the long-term positive effects that had continued to benefit the community years after the original incidents had been forgotten. The case exemplified the kind of police work that created lasting value rather than just addressing immediate symptoms. Work that built community capacity rather than just enforcing rules. Moving to another section of the archive, Chief Morrison pulled a file from the Economic Crime Resolution section, containing the documentation of a case that had begun as a simple investigation into check kiting at several local banks but had evolved into a comprehensive program for financial literacy education and small business support. The perpetrator had been a struggling single mother who had been using illegal check floating schemes to manage cash flow problems created by irregular income and unexpected expenses. Detective Patricia Santos had discovered that the woman's criminal behavior was motivated not by greed, but by desperation, as she tried to maintain stable housing and childcare while working multiple part-time jobs that provided insufficient income to meet her family's basic needs. Rather than simply prosecuting the case as fraud, Detective Santos had worked with social services, financial institutions, and community organizations to address the underlying economic vulnerabilities that had created the situation. The resolution had involved not only restitution for the financial losses, but also the development of a comprehensive support program that included financial counseling, job training, childcare assistance, and emergency loan programs for other families facing similar economic challenges. The woman who had committed the original crime had become one of the program's most effective advocates, using her experience to help other families avoid the desperation that had led to her illegal actions. File contains statistical reports showing how the program had reduced financial crime in the area, while also improving overall family stability and economic security throughout the community. The case had demonstrated how addressing root causes rather than just symptoms could create positive changes that benefited everyone involved, including the original perpetrator, who had been given the opportunity to make amends and contribute positively to her community. Chief Morrison found these files deeply satisfying to review, not because they represented dramatic police victories, but because they documented the patient, thoughtful work that had created lasting improvements in community life. Each case represented a moment when law enforcement had served its highest purpose, not just maintaining order, but actively contributing to the social health and resilience that made order possible. In the section devoted to elderly and vulnerable population cases, Chief Morrison pulled a file that documented an investigation into elder abuse at a local nursing home. The case had been complex and emotionally difficult, involving allegations that staff members were neglecting and mistreating residents who were unable to advocate for themselves effectively. The investigation had required careful coordination between police, social services, and health department, regulators to protect vulnerable people while ensuring fair treatment for accused staff members. Detective Helen Kim had led the investigation with characteristic thoroughness and sensitivity, recognizing that the case involved not just potential criminal behavior, but also broader questions about how society cared for its most vulnerable members. Her investigation had revealed that while some staff members had indeed been guilty of neglect and abuse, the problems were also related to inadequate staffing, insufficient training, and institutional policies that prioritized cost reduction over quality care. The resolution had involved not only criminal prosecution of individuals who had committed abuse, but also comprehensive reforms in staffing standards, training requirements, and oversight procedures that had improved care quality throughout the facility and had established new standards that were adopted by other nursing homes in the region. The case had led to the creation of an ombudsman program that provided ongoing advocacy and support for nursing home residents and their families. The file contained letters from families expressing gratitude for the thorough investigation and the systematic changes that had followed, as well as reports from state regulators noting the facility's transformation into a model for quality elder care. The case had demonstrated how law enforcement could serve as a catalyst for broader social improvements that protected vulnerable populations, while also strengthening institutions and professional standards. Chief Morrison moved to the Community Partnership Cases section, where she found documentation of a case that had begun as an investigation into drug dealing in a public park, but had evolved into a comprehensive community revitalization project that had transformed both the physical space and the social dynamics of the surrounding neighborhood. The original drug activity had been a symptom of broader problems, including unemployment, housing deterioration, and social isolation that had created conditions where illegal activities could flourish. Detective Robert Martinez had approached the case with an understanding that arresting drug dealers would not address the underlying conditions that made drug dealing attractive to young people who had few other economic opportunities. His investigation had led to the development of a partnership between law enforcement, community organizations, local businesses, and residents that had addressed the drug problem through comprehensive neighborhood improvement, rather than just increased enforcement. The resolution had involved creating legitimate employment opportunities for young people, improving housing conditions, establishing recreational and educational programs, and developing the kind of social connections that made illegal activities both less necessary and less tolerable to community members. The park that had been the site of drug dealing had been renovated and expanded, becoming a center for positive community activities that attracted families and strengthened neighborhood social networks. The file contained photographs showing the park's transformation from a neglected space avoided by law-abiding residents to a vibrant community resource that hosted festivals, sports leagues, educational programs, and cultural events that brought people together across racial, ethnic, and economic lines. The case had become a model for community-oriented approaches to drug enforcement that had been adopted by other police departments throughout the region. In the section devoted to youth and family cases, Chief Morrison found the documentation of a case that had involved a series of car thefts committed by teenagers who had been joyriding rather than stealing vehicles for profit. The case had revealed complex family dynamics and social pressures that had motivated the young people to engage in risky behavior as a way of asserting independence and gaining peer recognition. Detective Sarah Chun had worked with the teenagers' families, school counselors, and community organizations to develop alternative ways for the young people to experience excitement and achievement without breaking the law. The resolution had involved not only appropriate consequences for the car thefts, but also the creation of a youth driving program that provided legitimate opportunities for teenagers to develop automotive skills and experience the thrill of driving in safe, supervised environments. The program had expanded over the years to include not just driving instruction, but also automotive mechanics training, safety education, and mentorship opportunities that had helped many young people develop career interests and life skills while avoiding involvement in criminal activities. The teenagers who had originally been arrested for car theft had become some of the program's most effective peer mentors, using their experience to help other young people make better choices. The file contained follow-up reports tracking the long-term outcomes for the original participants, showing how the intervention had not only prevented future criminal behavior, but had also contributed to educational achievement, career development, and positive family relationships that had benefited entire households and strengthened the broader community. As Chief Morrison continued her review of the closed case files, she was struck by the consistency of certain themes that appeared across different types of crimes and different time periods. The most successful case resolutions were those that had addressed underlying causes rather than just immediate symptoms, that had strengthened community relationships rather than just punishing individual wrongdoing, and that had created positive opportunities rather than just removing negative influences. These files represented more than just successful police work. They documented a philosophy of law enforcement that understood crime as a community problem requiring community solutions, that saw police officers as facilitators of social healing rather than just enforcers of rules, and that measured success not just by arrests and convictions, but by the lasting improvements in community safety, health, and resilience that good police work could create. In the section devoted to mental health and social services coordination, Chief Morrison found a file that documented her own involvement in developing new approaches to responding to mental health crises that had traditionally been handled as law enforcement problems. The case had involved a series of incidents where individuals experiencing psychiatric emergencies had been arrested and jailed, rather than receiving appropriate medical care, creating a cycle of crisis, incarceration, and repeated emergency situations that served no one's interests effectively. Working with mental health professionals, hospital administrators, and social service agencies, Chief Morrison had helped develop a crisis intervention team that included both police officers and mental health clinicians who could respond together to situations involving people with psychiatric conditions. The new approach had reduced both arrests and repeat emergency calls while ensuring that people in mental health crisis received appropriate care rather than just legal consequences. The file contains statistical reports showing dramatic improvements in outcomes for people with mental illness who came into contact with law enforcement, as well as feedback from officers who had found the collaborative approach more satisfying and effective than traditional arrest and incarcerate methods. The program had been recognized as a national model for police mental health cooperation and had been replicated by departments throughout the country. The final section of the archive contained what Chief Morrison thought of as the legacy files, cases that had been resolved so successfully that they had become part of the institutional memory and standard operating procedures that guided current police work. These were not just individual success stories, but innovations and approaches that had been incorporated into training programs, policy manuals, and community partnership agreements that continued to shape how the department approached its work. One file documented the development of the community policing philosophy that had transformed the department's relationship with the neighborhoods it served, moving from a reactive enforcement model to a proactive partnership model that emphasized prevention, problem solving, and community capacity building. The transformation had taken place gradually over many years, guided by the lessons learned from individual cases that had demonstrated the effectiveness of collaborative approaches to crime prevention and community safety. Another file contained the documentation of the restorative justice program that had been developed to handle certain types of cases through community-based mediation and healing processes rather than traditional criminal prosecution. The program had been particularly effective for juvenile cases, domestic disputes, and property crimes where the goal was to repair harm and prevent future problems rather than just impose punishment. The restorative justice program had created opportunities for offenders to make direct amends to their victims and communities, while also addressing the underlying issues that had contributed to their criminal behavior. The program had achieved high rates of satisfaction among both victims and offenders, while also reducing recidivism and strengthening community bonds that made future crime less likely. As Chief Morrison completed her monthly review of the closed case files, she felt the deep satisfaction that came from knowing that these archived stories represented not just individual problems that had been solved, but a collective body of wisdom about how communities could respond to crime and conflict in ways that strengthened, rather than damaged, the social fabric that held everyone together. These files would remain here in the permanent archive, available for future generations of police officers, community leaders, and citizens who needed to understand that effective law enforcement was not just about catching criminals and enforcing laws, but about building the kind of communities where crime was less likely to occur and where everyone could live safely, peacefully, and with dignity. The archive room fell quiet as Chief Morrison turned off the lights and prepared to leave, but the silence was not empty. It was filled with the accumulated wisdom of thousands of cases that had been resolved through patience, creativity, and genuine care for community welfare. It was the silence of completion, of problems solved and communities healed, of stories that had found their proper endings in justice, understanding, and peace. Walking back through the basement corridors toward the elevator, Chief Morrison carried with her the knowledge that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to apply the lessons learned from all these archived cases to the ongoing work of maintaining community safety and social order. The files would wait patiently in their climate-controlled environment, ready to teach their lessons to anyone who took the time to learn from the accumulated experience of generations of dedicated public servants. The elevator carried her back to the main floor of the police station, where the night shift was maintaining its quiet vigil over the sleeping city. The officers on duty tonight would create tomorrow's case files, some of which would eventually join the permanent archive as examples of successful problem solving and community building. The cycle would continue, each day adding new stories to the vast collection of human experience that law enforcement accumulated in the course of its daily work. Outside, the city rested peacefully under the protective watch of officers who understood that their job was not just to respond to crime, but to nurture the conditions that made crime unnecessary and community life possible. The archived cases bore witness to decades of this patient work, standing as testimony to the possibility that law enforcement could serve as a force for positive change, social healing, and community resilience. In the deepest quiet of the archive room, where thousands of completed cases rested in their final files, there lived the gentle understanding that every ending was also a beginning, every resolution a foundation for future peace, every closed case a contribution to the collective wisdom that made civilized life possible. The archives held their vigil over these stories, preserving them for future generations who would need to understand that justice was not just an abstract ideal, but a practical reality that could be achieved through the patient, professional, and compassionate work of people who had dedicated their lives to serving others. The night settled peacefully over the city, and in the basement archives, 10,000 stories of crime transformed into healing, conflict resolved into understanding, and community problems solved through patience and care rested quietly in their eternal sleep, having completed their journey from crisis to resolution, from problem to solution, from ending to peaceful, eternal rest.